They called her the most dangerous woman in Europe, yet she's not in a single textbook. What did this forgotten hero do that terrified entire armies? Sleep awaits. History loves a good hero story. Superman saves the day. Batman fights crime. Wonder Woman conquers evil. But here's what they don't tell you in comic books. The real heroes of World War II weren't wearing capes. They were wearing aprons, work boots, and sometimes nothing more than their pajamas when danger knocked on their door. Most people think they know the big names from the war. Churchill with his cigars, Roosevelt in his wheelchair, Stalin with his mustache that could intimidate a grizzly bear. Those guys get all the credit, and sure, they did important stuff. But what about the teenage girl who poisoned Nazi officers in her school cafeteria? Or the 6-year-old French boy who carried secret messages in his toy box? Where are their statues? The thing about World War II is that it wasn't really won by generals in fancy rooms pointing at maps. It was won by millions of ordinary people who woke up one morning and decided they'd had enough. A baker in Belgium, a nurse in the Philippines, a mathematician in Poland who cracked codes that saved thousands of lives. These weren't professional soldiers or trained spies. Well, most of them weren't. They were just regular folks who found themselves in the middle of the biggest fight humanity had ever seen. Take this woman who worked as a radio operator in Nazi-occupied France. She parachuted behind enemy lines, got captured, tortured, and never said a word. The Nazis threw everything they had at her, and she just smiled and asked if they had any tea. Her code name was Rose, which sounds pretty and delicate, right? Wrong. This rose had thorns that could cut through steel, and her story stayed buried for decades because she never bragged about what she did. Then there's the Polish guy who voluntarily mind you, to get himself arrested and thrown into Auschwitz. Not because he lost a bet or went crazy, but because he wanted to gather evidence of what the Nazis were really doing. He spent 2 years inside that nightmare, smuggled out documents that proved the Holocaust was happening, and then broke out like some kind of action movie hero. Except this wasn't a movie. It was Tuesday afternoon in 1943. Women weren't sitting on the sidelines either. There was this Soviet sniper who picked off 309 enemy soldiers with the precision of someone threading a needle. She toured America, met President Roosevelt, and probably had better aim than most people have with their TV remote. The Germans were so terrified of her they nicknamed her Lady Death, which honestly sounds like a pretty good job title. The really wild part, most of these heroes never told anyone what they did. They came home after the war, hung up their courage like an old coat, and went back to normal life. The spy became a shop clerk, the resistance fighter became a teacher, the code breaker became someone's grandmother, who made excellent cookies and never mentioned she once held the fate of nations in her hands. Children got involved too, which sounds horrible until you realize these kids often had more guts than grown men with military training. A Dutch teenager used her innocent looks to lure Nazi soldiers into traps. Sisters in the Netherlands turned sabotage into a family business. A little French boy became a messenger for the resistance before he learned to tie his shoes properly. But here's what makes their stories even more incredible. Many of these heroes were fighting against their own governments, their neighbors, sometimes their own families. The German teens who opposed Hitler from inside Germany knew they'd be executed if caught. They did it anyway. The Japanese diplomat who saved thousands of Jewish refugees knew he was destroying his career and endangering his family. He kept signing those visas. Some of these heroes lived in places you've probably never heard of. Malta got bombed over 3,000 times and never surrendered. The entire island received the George Cross for collective bravery, which is like giving a medal to a whole country for being impossibly stubborn in the face of death. Others worked in secret for so long their own countries forgot about them. Code breakers who shortened the war by years, escape route builders who saved hundreds of Allied pilots, nurses who performed surgery in prison camps with kitchen knives and prayer. Their weapons weren't always guns and bombs. Sometimes it was a camera that captured the truth the world needed to see. Sometimes it was a song that carried secret messages. Sometimes it was just refusing to give up information no matter what horrors were inflicted. These forgotten heroes changed everything. Their small acts of defiance became the cracks that brought down the Nazi war machine, and most of them, they never expected a thank you. But some of their stories are so incredible, so impossible, that they sound like fiction, like the British agent who became the most wanted person in occupied France. Her real name was Eileen Neon, but the Nazis knew her as Rose. What they didn't know was that this quiet 23-year-old woman would become one of Britain's most stubborn secrets. The year was 1944. While most young women her age were working in factories or serving tea, Eileen was learning how to kill with her bare hands. The Special Operations Executive had chosen her for something far more dangerous than assembly lines. They needed someone who could blend into occupied France, operate a radio under the Nazis' noses, and most importantly, someone who wouldn't break under torture. Eileen fit the bill perfectly. Born to French parents but raised in England, she spoke both languages without an accent. More crucial than that, she had nerves of steel wrapped in the appearance of an ordinary girl. The Nazis would never suspect her. Well, that was the plan anyway. On March 2nd, 1944, Eileen parachuted into the French countryside near Orleans. Her mission was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. She had to establish radio contact between the French resistance and London, transmitting vital intelligence while staying invisible. The radio itself was a death sentence if discovered. German detection units could triangulate her position within minutes of transmission. But here's where Eileen's story gets wild. She didn't just survive, she thrived in the shadows. Operating under the codename Rose, she sent over 100 messages back to Britain. Each transmission contained details about German troop movements, supply lines, and planned operations, information that would save countless Allied lives during the liberation of France. The close calls started almost immediately. German detection vans prowled the streets, their antennas searching for unauthorized radio signals. Eileen had to constantly move, broadcasting from different locations, never staying in one place too long. She carried her radio equipment in a suitcase, looking like any other young woman traveling through wartime France, except her suitcase contained secrets that could change the war's outcome. Then came July 25, 1944, the day everything went sideways. German forces finally tracked down her transmission and raided the safe house where she was staying. Most agents in her position would have been caught red-handed with the radio, not Eileen. She managed to destroy her equipment and codebooks before the Gestapo broke down the door. What happened next would test every ounce of her training. The Germans arrested her, but they weren't certain she was a spy. They suspected, but they needed proof. Under interrogation, Eileen stuck to her cover story with remarkable composure. She claimed to be a simple French girl who had been visiting friends, nothing more, nothing less. The Gestapo wasn't buying it. They shipped her to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where conditions were designed to break even the strongest spirits. Prisoners faced starvation, disease, and systematic brutality. Many trained agents cracked within days of arrival. Eileen lasted months without revealing a single secret. Even when transferred to other camps, even when facing what seemed like certain death, she never told them about her radio work, never gave up the names of resistance fighters who had helped her, never admitted to being a British agent. Her silence saved dozens of lives, people who continued fighting because the Gestapo couldn't find them. The weird part is what happened after the war. While other SOE agents received medals and recognition, Eileen simply went home and never talked about her experiences. She worked as a telephone operator, lived quietly in a small apartment, and kept her wartime secrets locked away. Her neighbors had no idea they were living next to a genuine war hero. For nearly 60 years, Eileen Neon remained one of Britain's forgotten spies. She only began sharing her story in the early 2000s, when historians finally tracked her down. Even then, she spoke reluctantly about those dark months in occupied France. Makes sense, right? Some memories are too heavy to carry in the open. When Eileen died in 2010, she was found alone in her apartment. Initially, authorities thought she was just another elderly woman with no family or friends. Then they discovered a small box containing her wartime decorations and documents. The quiet lady from apartment 3B had been Rose all along. Her funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including veterans, historians, and grateful French citizens whose families had survived because of her silence under torture. The woman who had lived invisibly finally received the recognition she'd earned decades earlier. But Eileen wasn't the only person who volunteered for what seemed like a suicide mission during the war. Sometimes heroes didn't parachute into enemy territory. Sometimes they walked through the front gates of hell itself, with a plan so dangerous it bordered on insanity. Here's something most people would never choose to do: walk into hell on purpose. But that's exactly what Witold Pilecki did in 1940, while everyone else was trying to escape the Nazis. This Polish cavalry officer had a different plan. He wanted to get arrested. Sounds crazy? Well, Pilecki had his reasons. The world knew something terrible was happening at a place called Auschwitz, but nobody knew exactly what. Rumors floated around about a labor camp, maybe some harsh conditions, nothing more. The full truth remained hidden behind barbed wire and guard towers. Someone needed to get inside and find out what the Germans were really doing. So Pilecki did something that takes either incredible courage or complete madness. He walked into Warsaw during a Nazi roundup, carrying fake identity papers, and let himself get caught. Just like that, he became prisoner number 4859. The plan seemed simple enough: get inside, gather information, organize resistance from within, then escape to tell the world. Reality hit him fast. Auschwitz wasn't just a labor camp, it was a death factory. What Pilecki witnessed would haunt anyone for life. Mass executions happened daily. People died from starvation, disease, and brutal medical experiments. Guards beat prisoners to death for entertainment. The smell of burning bodies filled the air constantly. This wasn't war, as anyone understood it. This was systematic extermination. But here's where Pilecki's story gets even more remarkable. Instead of breaking down, he started building something, a secret network of prisoners who could resist from inside. They smuggled food to the weakest inmates. They passed messages between different sections of the camp. Most importantly, they documented everything they saw. Pilecki knew the world needed proof, so he wrote detailed reports about the gas chambers, the medical experiments, the daily murders. These weren't just stories or rumors anymore. They were eyewitness accounts from someone living in the middle of it all. Getting these reports out meant finding prisoners who were being released or transferred, then hoping they'd make it to the Polish underground. The documents that made it out painted a picture so horrifying that many people refused to believe them. Western governments received these reports but dismissed them as exaggerated propaganda. How could anyone believe that an entire industrial system existed just to kill people? The truth seemed too monstrous to be real. Meanwhile, Pilecki spent over 2 years inside this nightmare. He watched thousands die around him. He organized small acts of rebellion that saved some lives but couldn't stop the machine. Every day meant choosing between staying alive and helping others survive. Every night meant wondering if tomorrow would bring his own execution. Then came the hardest decision of all. After 947 days inside Auschwitz, Pilecki realized he needed to escape. The resistance network he'd built could continue without him, but the world outside needed someone who could speak with absolute authority about what was happening. Someone who had seen it all and lived to tell about it. His escape reads like something from an action movie. Working in a camp bakery, Pilecki and 2 other prisoners overpowered their guards, stole their weapons and cut through the fence. They ran through the Polish countryside for days, dodging Nazi patrols and living off whatever they could find. Most escape attempts from Auschwitz ended in capture and execution. These 3 made it. Back in Warsaw, Pilecki wrote the most detailed account of Auschwitz that existed at the time. 47 pages describing every aspect of the camp's operations. The report reached London, where it finally convinced Allied leaders that the rumors about Nazi death camps were absolutely true. But Pilecki wasn't finished fighting. During the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, he grabbed a rifle and joined the battle against German forces in the city. Even after surviving nearly 3 years in the world's most notorious death camp, he was ready to keep fighting. The war ended, but Pilecki's troubles didn't. When communist authorities took control of Poland, they saw him as a threat. His loyalty belonged to the free Poland he'd fought for, not the Soviet puppet state they were creating. In 1948, they arrested him on trumped-up charges of espionage. The same man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz and survived to tell the world about Nazi crimes was executed by firing squad in 1948. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. For decades, communist Poland treated him as a traitor rather than a hero. Only after communism fell did people begin to understand what Pilecki had accomplished. His Auschwitz report became recognized as one of the most important documents of the Holocaust. His voluntary mission provided the first detailed evidence of Nazi genocide. The courage it took to walk into Auschwitz defies easy explanation. But sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who choose to go where others fear to tread. Speaking of impossible battles, there's another story about someone who faced overwhelming odds with deadly precision. Most people think being a sniper means hiding in shadows, taking one shot, then disappearing. Well, Lyudmila Pavlichenko threw that playbook out the window. This Ukrainian woman didn't just break gender barriers, she obliterated them with deadly precision. Born in 1916, Lyudmila started as a factory worker who enjoyed target shooting as a hobby. Pretty normal stuff, right? But when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she made a decision that would change everything. While other women were encouraged to work in factories or serve as nurses, Lyudmila marched straight to the army recruitment office and demanded to fight on the front lines. The recruiting officers laughed. They handed her a rifle, expecting her to fail the marksmanship test spectacularly. Instead, she hit every target dead center. Their laughter stopped immediately. Within months, Lyudmila was deployed to Odessa, then later to Sevastopol. These weren't quiet countryside positions where she could pick off enemies from comfortable distances. We're talking about brutal urban warfare, where German snipers were hunting Soviet soldiers daily. The life expectancy for a sniper in these conditions, about 3 weeks if you were lucky. Lyudmila lasted much longer than 3 weeks. She spent over a year in active combat, methodically eliminating Nazi soldiers one by one. Her approach wasn't random. She studied patterns, memorized enemy movements, and waited for perfect shots. Sometimes she'd lie motionless for hours in bombed-out buildings waiting for a single opportunity. But here's what makes her story truly remarkable. She wasn't just surviving, she was dominating. Other snipers might celebrate hitting 10 or 20 targets. Lyudmila kept a detailed count that climbed higher every week. 50 kills, 100 kills, 200 kills. The numbers kept rising. German commanders became obsessed with eliminating her. They sent their best counter-snipers specifically to hunt her down. Propaganda leaflets dropped over Soviet positions offered huge rewards for information about her location. The Nazis even tried psychological warfare, broadcasting messages over loudspeakers trying to convince her to surrender. None of it worked. Instead of intimidating her, these tactics seemed to make her more determined. She developed an almost supernatural ability to detect enemy snipers before they spotted her. Fellow soldiers started calling her Lady Death, though never to her face. She preferred being treated like any other soldier. Then something interesting happened. In 1942, after she'd been wounded by mortar fire, Soviet leadership decided she was too valuable to risk losing in combat. They pulled her from the front lines, but not to sit quietly in Moscow. Instead, they sent her on a goodwill tour to the United States and Canada. American audiences had never seen anything like Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Here was this young woman, barely in her 20s, calmly discussing killing over 300 enemy soldiers. She met with President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She gave speeches to packed auditoriums. American reporters kept asking her about makeup, fashion, and whether Soviet women were allowed to curl their hair. Her response was perfect. At one press conference she told reporters, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The room went completely silent. This wasn't some propaganda puppet reading prepared statements. This was a combat veteran who'd seen more action than most male soldiers, calling out American journalists for focusing on trivial nonsense while people were dying in Europe. Eleanor Roosevelt became fascinated by Lyudmila's story. The two women developed an unlikely friendship, exchanging letters for years after the war. Eleanor later wrote that meeting Lyudmila changed her understanding of what women could accomplish under extreme circumstances. Back in the Soviet Union, Lyudmila's final kill count reached 309 confirmed eliminations. That number isn't propaganda. It was verified by multiple witnesses and military records. She became the most successful female sniper in history, a record that still stands today. After the war ended, she could have become a celebrity, writing books and giving interviews about her experiences. Instead, she chose a quieter path. She finished her education, became a historian, and rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. When reporters tracked her down years later, she seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. What's fascinating is how her story reveals something deeper about World War II heroism. While generals planned massive battles and politicians made speeches, individual soldiers like Lyudmila were winning the war one precise shot at a time. Her methodical approach, combined with nerves of steel, saved countless Soviet lives by eliminating enemy soldiers who would have killed her comrades. Yet she never bragged about her achievements or sought recognition. But speaking of unlikely war heroes, imagine someone volunteering to walk directly into the most notorious concentration camp in Nazi Germany. That takes a completely different kind of courage. Most people lose their dominant hand and figure their fighting days are over. Lachiman Gurung wasn't most people. When a Japanese grenade blew off his right hand and destroyed his left eye during a brutal attack in Burma, this Gurkha soldier did something that defies all logic. He kept fighting. The date was May 12, 1945. World War II was winding down, but nobody told the Japanese forces still dug in across Southeast Asia. Gurung's rifle company was holding a strategic position near a village called Tongdor when the enemy decided to throw everything they had at them. We're talking about 200 Japanese soldiers charging at a handful of defenders in the dead of night. Then things got worse. Much worse. The first grenade landed right next to Gurung's position. Most soldiers would duck for cover, not this guy. He grabbed the live grenade with his bare right hand and hurled it back toward the enemy lines. Smart move, except the thing exploded while he was throwing it. The blast tore off his hand completely and shredded his face, leaving him blind in one eye and bleeding everywhere. Here's where the story gets absolutely wild. Instead of calling for a medic or retreating to safety, Gurung propped his rifle on his left shoulder and kept shooting, one-handed, half-blind. For the next 4 hours, the Japanese kept coming in waves, probably thinking they could easily overrun what looked like a wounded, defenseless position. Wrong assumption. Gurung was picking them off one by one with his left hand, despite losing massive amounts of blood and fighting through pain that would have knocked most people unconscious. His fellow soldiers later said they could hear him shouting Gurkha battle cries between rifle shots. But here's the thing that really sets this apart from other war stories. Gurung wasn't just holding his ground randomly, he was defending the only approach route the enemy could use to reach his company's main position. If he failed, his entire unit would be surrounded and slaughtered. The guy knew this. Every shot mattered. By dawn, when reinforcements finally arrived, they found something incredible. 31 dead Japanese soldiers lay scattered around Gurung's position. 31. He'd taken down more than an entire platoon while fighting with one hand and one eye. The remaining attackers had retreated, completely demoralized by what they'd witnessed. The weird part is how calm Gurung was when they found him. Still conscious, still alert, casually mentioning that his hand was a bit sore, and asking if anyone had seen his fingers lying around. Classic Gurkha understatement. The medics were amazed he was even alive, let alone cracking jokes about his missing body parts. Word of his actions spread quickly through military channels. When King George VI heard the full story, he immediately approved Gurung for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The citation read like something out of an action movie, except every single detail was verified by multiple witnesses and commanding officers. What makes Gurung's story even more remarkable is what happened after the war. Unlike many decorated soldiers who struggled with fame or used their heroic status for personal gain, he simply went back to his quiet life in Nepal. No book deals, no speaking tours, no attempts to cash in on his legendary status. He just wanted to be left alone. For decades, hardly anyone knew that one of World War II's most decorated soldiers was living as a simple farmer in the Himalayas. Gurung rarely talked about the war, even with family members. When journalists occasionally tracked him down for interviews, he'd usually just smile and say that he was doing his duty, nothing more. The Victoria Cross citation officially credits him with conspicuous gallantry and notes that his actions undoubtedly saved the lives of his comrades. But those dry military terms don't capture the sheer audacity of what actually happened that night. A one-handed, half-blind soldier holding off an entire company of enemy troops for 4 straight hours isn't just gallantry, it's something close to superhuman. Modern military experts who study the Battle of Tongdo still can't quite explain how Gurung managed such accurate shooting under those conditions. The physical mechanics alone should have made it nearly impossible. Add in the shock, blood loss, and darkness, and what he accomplished starts looking less like military tactics, and more like pure willpower made manifest. Gurung lived to be 92, spending most of his later years tending to his small farm and occasionally helping younger veterans understand their service. He never complained about his disabilities or demanded special treatment for his wartime sacrifices. The lesson here isn't just about individual courage under fire. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroism comes from ordinary people who simply refuse to quit when everything goes wrong. But Gurung's story raises an interesting question about the nature of heroism itself, especially when we consider what drives someone to keep fighting against impossible odds. After enduring incredible hardships like Lakshman Gurung fighting off 200 enemies with one arm, war often creates symbols that outlast the battles themselves. Some moments become frozen in time, inspiring entire nations. But what happens when you become part of the most famous photograph in American military history? And what if that fame becomes a burden you can't escape? Ira Hayes probably never imagined he'd become one of the most recognizable faces in America when he enlisted in the Marines in 1942. This quiet Pima Indian from Arizona just wanted to serve his country. Makes sense, right? Native Americans had been defending this land long before it was called the United States. But Hayes was about to participate in something that would make him famous worldwide. whether he wanted it or not. The year was 1945, and American forces were locked in a brutal battle for Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island in the Pacific. The Japanese had turned every cave and tunnel into a fortress. American casualties were staggering. Then there's this mountain called Mount Suribachi, rising like a jagged tooth from the island's southern tip. Taking that mountain meant everything for American morale. Hayes was part of the 28th Marines, tasked with climbing this deadly peak. The Japanese had excellent views from up there, picking off Americans like targets at a shooting range. But on February 23rd, after days of fierce fighting, a small patrol finally reached the summit. They raised an American flag. Actually they raised 2 flags that day, but history only remembers one. The second flag raising happened because the first flag was too small. Military commanders wanted something bigger, something visible to troops fighting below. So Hayes and 5 other Marines grabbed a larger flag and a heavy iron pipe. Up they went again. This time Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal was ready with his camera. Click. 1 photograph. 6 soldiers straining to plant that flag in Iwo Jima's rocky soil. Hayes is the one on the far left, his hands gripping the pole. But here's the weird part about this famous moment. It almost didn't happen. Rosenthal had been taking pictures all day, and wasn't even sure he'd captured anything special. He wouldn't see the developed photograph for several days. That image exploded across America like wildfire. Newspapers printed it on front pages. The government used it to sell war bonds. Hollywood wanted to make movies about it. 3 of the 6 flag raisers had been killed in subsequent fighting, but Hayes and the 2 other survivors became instant celebrities. They were flown back to the United States for a massive publicity tour. This is where Hayes' story takes a darker turn. Being famous wasn't something this reserved Native American had ever wanted. The government paraded him around the country, asking him to retell the same story hundreds of times. Crowds cheered. Politicians shook his hand. Everyone wanted to meet the hero from the famous photograph. But Hayes knew something that made all this attention feel hollow. The flag raising itself lasted maybe 30 seconds. The real heroes were the guys still fighting and dying on Iwo Jima, while he was back home signing autographs. He felt like a fraud. The battle for Iwo Jima cost over 25,000 American casualties. Hayes survived because of a photograph, not because he was braver than anyone else. The weight of unwanted fame crushed him after the war ended. He struggled with alcohol, trying to numb the guilt and pressure. Jobs were hard to find for Native Americans, even war heroes. The reservation in Arizona felt worlds away from the cheering crowds and flashbulbs. Hayes worked construction, picked cotton, did whatever he could to make ends meet. People recognized him everywhere he went. That photograph had burned his face into American memory. Some folks treated him like a living monument. Others just saw another Indian struggling with drinking problems. The contrast was brutal. One day you're a symbol of American courage, the next day you're ignored or judged. Hayes died in 1955 at just 32 years old, found in a field near his Arizona home. The official cause was exposure and alcohol poisoning, but many who knew him said he died from the impossible burden of being a reluctant symbol. The irony cuts deep here. That photograph did exactly what it was supposed to do. It inspired millions of Americans during the war's final months. It became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington, D.C. But the man in the picture paid a price that few understood at the time. Yet Hayes' story reveals something important about heroism during World War II. Sometimes the most meaningful acts of courage happened away from cameras and crowds, performed by people who never sought recognition. Speaking of unrecognized courage, 2 teenage Dutch sisters were about to prove that the most dangerous resistance fighters could be the ones nobody suspected. Most teenage girls in Nazi-occupied Netherlands worried about schoolwork and friends. Freddy and Truus Overstegen had different concerns, like how to lure German soldiers into deadly ambushes without getting caught. The sisters were just 14 and 16 when they joined the Dutch resistance in 1941. Their mother, a communist sympathizer, had raised them to hate fascism. But nobody expected these young girls to become 2 of the most effective saboteurs in the resistance movement. The Nazis certainly didn't see them coming. Truus, the older sister, was barely out of childhood when she first approached resistance leaders. They laughed at her, a teenage girl wanting to fight armed German soldiers. Ridiculous. Then she proved them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The sisters developed a simple but deadly strategy. They would dress up, put on makeup, and approach German soldiers in bars or on the street. Flirting came naturally. What soldier wouldn't trust a pretty Dutch girl offering to show him around? The Germans followed eagerly, thinking they were about to have a romantic evening. Instead, They walked straight into resistance ambushes in the woods. Freddie later admitted she never felt guilty about these operations. "We were at war," she said, decades later. "They were the enemy." The sisters understood something many adults missed. Their youth was their greatest weapon. Nobody suspected teenage girls of being deadly resistance fighters, but the Oversteegen sisters didn't limit themselves to honeypot operations. They became experts at sabotage, blowing up railway lines and German supply depots. Truus learned to handle explosives with scary precision. She could plant a bomb, set the timer, and walk away like nothing happened. The Germans never suspected the quiet teenager who passed them on the street. The weird part is how they balanced normal teenage life with resistance work. Truus would attend school during the day, then sneak out at night to blow up German infrastructure. She did homework between sabotage missions. Talk about time management skills. Their most dangerous work involved helping Jewish families escape to safety. The sisters guided refugees through secret routes, hiding them in safe houses across the Netherlands. This wasn't just risky, it was a death sentence if they got caught. The Nazis showed no mercy to anyone helping Jews, especially not to teenage girls who were supposed to be harmless. One operation almost ended everything. The sisters were transporting a Jewish family through the countryside when German patrols surrounded their location. Truus made a split-second decision that saved everyone's lives. She told the family to hide in a ditch while she and Freddie created a distraction. They started arguing loudly about boyfriend troubles, complete with tears and dramatic gestures. The German soldiers, hearing what sounded like a typical teenage fight, moved on without investigating further. Makes sense, right? Who would suspect girls having a loud argument about romance of being dangerous resistance operatives? The sisters' success rate was remarkable. They completed dozens of sabotage missions without getting captured. They helped countless Jewish families reach safety. They eliminated German soldiers who never saw death coming from two pretty teenagers, and they did it all while maintaining the appearance of normal Dutch schoolgirls. Their mother played a crucial role providing cover stories and alibis when needed. She never questioned her daughter's dangerous activities. If anything, she encouraged them. The Oversteegen household had become an unofficial resistance headquarters, with teenage girls planning military operations in the living room. As the war dragged on, the sisters' operations became more sophisticated. They learned advanced demolition techniques. They developed networks of informants and safe houses. They coordinated with other resistance cells across the country. These weren't amateur teenage rebels. They had evolved into professional soldiers. The psychological pressure was enormous. Living a double life meant constant fear of discovery. One wrong word, one suspicious neighbor, one German patrol asking too many questions. Any of these could have meant torture and execution. Yet the sisters never cracked under the strain. When liberation finally came in 1945, the Oversteegen sisters had spent their entire teenage years fighting a secret war. They had missed normal adolescent experiences, trading school dances for sabotage missions and first dates for resistance operations. They had grown up faster than any teenagers should have to. After the war, both sisters struggled to adjust to peaceful life. How do you go from being a deadly saboteur to being a regular citizen? They rarely spoke about their wartime experiences, even to close friends. The skills that had kept them alive during the war, deception, violence, constant vigilance, didn't translate well to peacetime. Their story remained largely unknown for decades. The Dutch resistance had many heroes, and two teenage girls didn't seem particularly newsworthy, but their contributions were massive, saving countless lives through operations that required incredible courage and skill. While the Oversteegen sisters used their youth as a weapon in occupied Europe, thousands of miles away, an even younger resistance fighter was about to prove that heroism has no minimum age requirement. Most people think children had no place in wartime resistance movements. They're wrong. While adults debated strategy in smoky rooms, some kids were already risking their lives for freedom. Marcel Pinty proves that heroes come in the smallest packages. 6 years old, that's kindergarten age for most children. Marcel should have been playing with toy soldiers, not helping real ones. Instead, this French boy became one of the youngest resistance fighters in World War II history. His story sounds impossible until you realize how desperate times create desperate measures. The Germans occupied France in 1940, turning daily life upside down. Adults whispered in corners about fighting back, but who would suspect a child? Marcel's family lived near German checkpoints and military positions, perfect for gathering intelligence. The resistance needed someone invisible, someone the Nazis would never question. Enter Marcel Pinty, age 6, carrying more courage than most adults twice his size. His missions started simple enough: walk past German positions, count soldiers, remember what vehicles looked like. Easy tasks for a curious kid who loved exploring anyway. But Marcel wasn't just playing war games. He was memorizing real troop movements, real weapons, real plans that could save or doom entire operations. The weird part is how naturally he took to spy work. While other children played house, Marcel practiced walking casually past enemy soldiers. He learned to act bored when German officers talked nearby. Most importantly, he discovered that adults rarely pay attention to small children. This invisibility became his greatest weapon. Marcel's handlers gave him coded messages to carry between resistance cells. Nothing written down, of course. Everything memorized. A 6-year-old brain storing information that could get dozens of people killed if discovered. The pressure would break most adults, yet Marcel handled it like another childhood game. Then there's the question everyone asks: what kind of parents let their 6-year-old become a spy? The answer reveals how war changes normal family rules. Marcel's parents weren't careless. They were French patriots watching their country suffer under Nazi boots. When the resistance asked for help, they offered their most precious possession, their son. Marcel's youth provided perfect cover for dangerous missions. German soldiers saw a small boy walking down the street and thought nothing of it. They never imagined this child carried intelligence about their next patrol routes or supply deliveries. His innocent face became the resistance secret advantage. But childhood spies face unique dangers. Adults can blend into crowds, change appearances, or fight back when cornered. 6-year-olds have none of these options. Marcel depended entirely on staying unnoticed, never arousing suspicion, never acting older than his years. One mistake could expose not just him but entire resistance networks. His typical day would make modern parents faint with worry: walk past German checkpoints, memorize guard rotations, deliver coded messages to strangers, then return home for dinner like nothing happened. Marcel lived a double life that would challenge experienced adult agents. The resistance used Marcel's size for infiltration missions too small for grown-ups. He could squeeze through spaces adults couldn't reach, hide in places no one would think to search, and escape through gaps that would trap bigger people. His physical limitations became tactical advantages. What strikes you most about Marcel's story isn't just his bravery, it's his professionalism. He never bragged about missions, never told friends about his secret life, never acted like the war hero he was becoming. At 6 years old, Marcel understood operational security better than some career intelligence officers. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Imagine carrying life or death secrets at an age when most kids worry about bedtime stories. Marcel couldn't share his fears with friends, couldn't seek comfort from teachers, couldn't even fully understand the historical forces surrounding him. He was completely alone with responsibilities that would crush most adults. Marcel's intelligence work helped coordinate resistance attacks throughout his region. Information he gathered led to successful sabotage operations against German supply lines. His seemingly innocent walks provided critical data that saved Allied lives and disrupted Nazi plans. A 6-year-old boy was actively changing the course of World War II. But war stories don't always have happy endings, especially for the youngest heroes. Marcel's missions grew more dangerous as the resistance became bolder. Eventually, his luck ran out. The exact details remain unclear, but Marcel Pinty died in service to his country before his 7th birthday. The resistance honored Marcel as their youngest martyr. His sacrifice proved that heroism has no age limit, that even children can choose courage over safety when freedom hangs in the balance. Marcel became a symbol of innocence lost but never wasted. His story connects to something larger about wartime resistance. While Marcel was carrying messages in France, another teenager across Europe was making even deadlier choices against the Nazi occupation. Marcel Pinty wasn't the only child caught up in the brutal machinery of World War II. Across the Soviet Union, another young person was making choices that would define courage itself. Her name was Zinaida Portnova, and she was just 14 when the Nazis invaded her homeland. Most teenagers worry about homework and friends. Zinaida worried about surviving German occupation, while secretly planning to kill enemy officers. The year was 1941, and her quiet life in Belarus had vanished overnight when Wehrmacht troops marched through her village. Here's where things get interesting. Zinaida didn't pick up a rifle or throw grenades like you might expect from resistance stories. Instead, She chose a weapon that was both deadly and completely invisible: poison. She worked in a German military kitchen, serving meals to Nazi officers who never suspected the young girl bringing their food was plotting their deaths. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. German soldiers needed to eat. Someone had to prepare their meals. Why not have that someone be a resistance fighter with access to toxic substances? Zinaida mixed rat poison into soups and stews, watching calmly as enemy officers consumed what would become their final meals. But here's the terrifying part about being a teenage spy. One day, German officers became suspicious about the unusually high number of food poisoning cases in their ranks. They decided to test their theory in the most direct way possible. They forced Zinaida to eat the soup she had just prepared. She knew the soup was poisoned. She had mixed the deadly ingredients herself just minutes earlier. Yet she couldn't refuse without revealing her role in the resistance. So she ate it. Actually ate poisoned soup to maintain her cover. The dose wasn't lethal, but it made her violently ill for days. Most people would have quit after nearly dying from their own sabotage efforts. Not Zinaida. She recovered and went right back to her deadly kitchen work, finding new ways to eliminate German personnel. Her resistance cell appreciated having someone so young and seemingly innocent working inside enemy facilities. Then there's the broader scope of her activities. Poisoning food was just one part of Zinaida's resistance work. She also carried messages between partisan groups, helped coordinate attacks on German supply lines, and gathered intelligence about enemy troop movements. All while maintaining the appearance of a harmless local girl. German authorities eventually caught on to the pattern of deaths and illnesses among their ranks. They launched investigations, rounded up suspects, and began torturing anyone they thought might be involved. Zinaida's luck ran out in 1943 when she was captured during a resistance operation. What happened next shows why some heroes become legends while others remain footnotes. Under interrogation and torture, Zinaida refused to reveal any information about her resistance activities or fellow fighters. German officers used every brutal technique they knew to break her spirit and extract names of other partisans. She never talked. Not once. Even as a 16-year-old facing unimaginable pain and certain death, she protected the secrets that would have led to the capture and execution of dozens of other resistance members. The Nazis executed her in January 1944, but they never learned what they wanted to know. Well, here's something that might surprise you about wartime recognition. Zinaida's story didn't end with her death. The Soviet government posthumously awarded her the title Hero of the Soviet Union, their highest honor for bravery. Her hometown erected monuments to her memory, and schools across Belarus still teach children about her courage. The weird part is how different countries remember their young heroes. While some nations barely acknowledge child resistance fighters, the Soviet Union actively celebrated them as examples of patriotic sacrifice. Zinaida became a symbol of youth standing up to fascism, inspiring other teenagers to join the fight against occupation. Makes sense, right? A girl who chose poison as her weapon against an occupying army deserves to be remembered alongside famous generals and decorated soldiers. Her methods were unconventional, but her results were measurably effective in weakening German military capabilities. But why does her story matter today? Because it challenges our assumptions about what heroes look like and how they operate. Zinaida wasn't a trained soldier or professional spy. She was a teenager who decided that serving poisoned soup was her contribution to defeating fascism. Her legacy raises uncomfortable questions about the cost of resistance and the sacrifices ordinary people make during extraordinary times. Every meal she poisoned represented enemy lives ended by a girl who should have been in school instead of planning military operations. The Soviet Union produced many teenage resistance fighters during the war, but few matched Zinaida's combination of cunning, courage, and ultimate sacrifice. Her willingness to risk everything, including eating her own poisoned food, set her apart from other young partisans. However, not all resistance heroes worked alone or relied on stealth and poison. Some built entire networks designed to save lives rather than take them, creating escape routes that would change the fate of hundreds of Allied personnel trapped behind enemy lines. Most people think of wartime nurses as gentle caregivers working safely behind the lines. André de Jong had other plans. This Belgian nurse decided that healing wounded soldiers wasn't enough. She wanted to prevent more wounds by getting Allied airmen back in the fight. Picture occupied Belgium in 1940. The Nazis had rolled through like they owned the place, which they basically did. Crashed Allied pilots were scattered across the countryside, hiding in barns and basements. Most would end up as prisoners of war, But Andrei, barely 24 years old, looked at this situation and thought, not on my watch. She didn't just help one or two pilots escape. This woman built an entire underground railroad for downed airmen stretching from Belgium all the way to neutral Spain. They called it the Comet Line, and it became one of the most successful escape networks of the entire war. The route was absolutely brutal. First, pilots had to make it through occupied Belgium without getting caught. Then came the real challenge, crossing the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. We're talking about hiking through freezing mountain passes at night, dodging Nazi patrols and hoping your guide didn't turn out to be a double agent. Andrei didn't just organize this network from some safe hideout. She personally guided airmen on these dangerous journeys, making the treacherous mountain crossing over and over again. The woman made this death-defying trip 32 times. 32 times. Most people won't even drive across town twice in one day. Her code name was Dede, and she became legendary among Allied airmen. But here's what makes her story even more incredible. The British intelligence services initially refused to believe she existed. When they first heard reports about this escape line, they assumed the leader had to be a man. A young woman couldn't possibly be running such a sophisticated operation, right? Wrong. The Comet Line wasn't just Andrei working alone. She recruited an entire network of brave civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, even teenagers. They risked their lives daily, knowing that capture meant torture and execution. The Nazis offered huge rewards for information about the escape network, but these ordinary people kept the secret. Then there's the question of money. Running an escape network wasn't cheap. Fake documents, safe houses, food and bribes all cost serious cash. Andrei somehow managed to finance the entire operation, often using her own family's resources. Her father even joined the network, proving that courage ran in the family. The success rate was remarkable. Between 1941 and 1944, the Comet Line helped over 800 Allied servicemen escape Nazi-occupied territory. That's 800 experienced pilots and crew members who could return to the fight instead of rotting in prison camps. Each one of those airmen represented thousands of hours of training and enormous resources. But the Nazis weren't stupid. They knew something was up and started closing in on the network. In 1943, Andrei's luck finally ran out. She was betrayed by an informant and captured while trying to cross into Spain with 3 American airmen. The Gestapo had finally caught their prize. What happened next shows exactly what kind of person Andrei was. Under interrogation, she could have revealed the entire network, saving her own life by destroying hundreds of others. Instead, she kept her mouth shut. Even when they threatened her with execution, she gave them nothing useful. The Nazis sent her to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she spent the rest of the war. Most people wouldn't have survived what she endured there, but Andrei was tougher than most people. She made it through until liberation in 1945, though she never fully recovered from the experience. After the war, multiple countries lined up to honor her. Belgium made her a countess. Britain awarded her the George Medal. The United States gave her the Medal of Freedom. France honored her with the Legion of Honor. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the airmen themselves. Dozens of them stayed in touch with her for the rest of their lives. What's fascinating is how Andrei transformed from a small-town nurse into one of the war's most effective resistance leaders. She had no military training, no intelligence background, just an unshakable belief that people needed help and she could provide it. Sometimes the most unlikely people become the most essential heroes. While Andrei was building escape routes in Western Europe, other unsung heroes were fighting different battles behind enemy lines. Some of them were using their minds instead of their courage, breaking codes that seemed impossible to crack. While heroes fought with guns and grenades on battlefields, one quiet mathematician in Poland was waging a different kind of war. His weapon, pure brain power. His target, the most sophisticated code machine the world had ever seen. Marian Rejewski didn't know it yet, but his mathematical genius would crack open Nazi Germany's biggest secret and change the entire course of the war. The year was 1932, and Poland sat nervously between 2 growing threats. The Polish Cipher Bureau needed to know what their neighbors were planning. They'd intercepted German radio messages, but they were scrambled by something called the Enigma machine. This wasn't your typical secret code. The Enigma could create over 150 million different combinations. Breaking it seemed impossible. Most code breakers tried to guess patterns or use traditional methods. Rejewski threw that playbook out the window. He approached Enigma like a math problem, not a word puzzle. While others focused on the letters, he studied the machine's internal wiring. Makes sense, right? You can't beat a machine by thinking like a human. Rejewski spent months mapping the electrical pathways inside Enigma rotors. He used something called group theory, complex mathematics that most people couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. But here's the brilliant part. He realized that the machine's daily settings created mathematical patterns. The Germans thought these patterns were invisible. They were wrong. By 1933, Rejewski had cracked the Enigma code, not just once. He could read German messages regularly. Poland suddenly had a window into Nazi military planning. They built their own Enigma machines and started intercepting everything from troop movements to supply orders. The intelligence was gold, but keeping it secret was even more valuable. Then there's the weird part. As war clouds gathered over Europe, the Polish government made an incredible decision. In July 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded, they invited British and French codebreakers to a secret meeting. Rejewski and his team revealed everything. They handed over their methods, their replica machines, and years of breakthrough research. The British couldn't believe what they were seeing. They'd been struggling with Enigma for years, getting nowhere. Suddenly Polish mathematicians were showing them the keys to the kingdom. Alan Turing and the team at Bletchley Park would later get credit for breaking Enigma, but they built on Rejewski's foundation. Without his mathematical approach, Bletchley Park might never have succeeded. But why did Poland give away such valuable secrets? They knew the coming war would overwhelm them. Better to share the knowledge with allies who could use it effectively than let it die with them. Smart move, considering what happened next. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Rejewski fled to France. He continued working on German codes, staying one step ahead of the Nazi advance. Later, when France fell, he escaped again, this time to Britain. The man who'd first cracked Enigma spent the war years helping the Allies read Nazi communications. The impact was staggering. Enigma intelligence, codenamed Ultra, helped the Allies win crucial battles in North Africa, the Atlantic, and eventually D-Day itself. Historians estimate that breaking Enigma shortened the war by 2 to 4 years. Millions of lives were saved because a Polish mathematician looked at an impossible problem and solved it with pure logic. After the war, Rejewski returned to Poland and worked as an accountant. Can you believe that? The man who helped win World War II spent his later years balancing books for a small company. Communist authorities didn't want to celebrate his achievements. They preferred heroes who fit their narrative better. For decades, almost nobody knew about Rejewski's contribution. The British kept Ultra secret until the 1970s, and Polish achievements were buried even deeper. When the truth finally came out, Rejewski was already in his 70s. He'd spent most of his life watching others get credit for work he'd pioneered. The most remarkable thing about Rejewski wasn't just his brilliance, it was his approach. While others saw Enigma as an unbreakable code, he saw it as a solvable equation. That shift in perspective made all the difference. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from asking different questions, not finding better answers. Rejewski's story reminds us that war heroes come in many forms. Some charge machine gun nests or fly dangerous missions. Others sit quietly with pencils and paper, unraveling mathematical mysteries that save more lives than any bullet ever could. His equations were as deadly as any weapon in the Allied arsenal. Mathematical genius wasn't the only surprising weapon the Allies discovered during the war. Sometimes the most effective resistance came from the most unexpected places, including high-ranking officials working right inside the Nazi machine itself. Most Nazi officials followed orders without question. They carried out Hitler's commands like robots, never thinking twice about the human cost. But Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz wasn't like the others. This German diplomat stationed in Copenhagen faced an impossible choice in 1943. His bosses in Berlin had sent clear instructions: help round up Denmark's Jewish population for deportation. The operation was scheduled for October 1st. Every Jewish family would be arrested during Rosh Hashanah, when they'd be gathered together for religious observances. Duckwitz knew what deportation really meant. He'd seen the reports. He understood the Nazi machine better than most because he was part of it. The weird part is, nobody expected this middle-aged bureaucrat to become a hero. He wasn't a resistance fighter or a spy. He was just a government official doing paperwork and attending meetings. But sometimes the most ordinary people make the most extraordinary choices. Instead of following orders, Duckwitz made a decision that would save thousands of lives. He secretly contacted Hans Hedtoft, a Danish politician, and leaked the entire Nazi plan. The deportation was supposed to be a surprise attack. Duckwitz turned it into a rescue mission. Word spread through Denmark's Jewish community like wildfire. Synagogues passed urgent messages. Neighbors warned neighbors. Complete strangers offered help to families they'd never met before. But warning people was only half the battle. Where could 8,000 Jews hide from the Nazi war machine? Denmark is a small country surrounded by German forces. There weren't many options. Then Duckwitz pulled off something even more remarkable. He used his diplomatic connections to contact Sweden, convincing Swedish officials to accept Danish Jewish refugees. This wasn't just about finding hiding spots in attics or basements. He was organizing an entire nation's worth of people to disappear across the sea. The escape operation became a massive community effort. Danish fishermen volunteered their boats. Doctors gave sedatives to crying babies so they wouldn't make noise during the journey. Teachers, shopkeepers and factory workers all pitched in. Everyone kept their mouths shut. Duckwitz continued his regular duties during the day, attending Nazi meetings and filing reports as if nothing had changed. He had to act completely normal while secretly coordinating one of the war's most successful rescue operations. One wrong word or suspicious glance could have exposed everything. The numbers tell the whole story. When the Nazis finally launched their deportation raids on October 1st, they found almost empty apartments. Out of Denmark's roughly 7,800 Jewish citizens, only 481 were captured. The rest had vanished into the night. Most of them made it safely to Sweden within just a few weeks. Fishing boats carried families across the narrow stretch of water between the two countries. Some refugees hid in cargo holds, others pretended to be crew members. The operation was so well organized that even elderly people and small children completed the dangerous journey. Makes sense that the Nazis were furious, right? They'd planned a perfect trap and caught almost nobody. German commanders launched investigations trying to figure out what went wrong. They suspected there was a leak somewhere, but never pinpointed the source. Duckwitz managed to keep his cover throughout the entire war. He continued working for the German government while secretly helping the resistance whenever possible. His colleagues never suspected that their mild-mannered diplomat was actually working against them. The Danish rescue operation became legendary throughout Europe. Other countries had tried to protect their Jewish populations, but none succeeded on this scale. Denmark saved 99% of its Jews through pure teamwork and courage. After the war ended, Duckwitz returned to diplomatic work. He served as West Germany's ambassador to Denmark, which must have been interesting given his wartime activities. The Danish people certainly remembered what he'd done for them. But here's the remarkable thing about Duckwitz. He never bragged about his actions. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews about his heroic deeds. He just went back to his quiet life as a government official. Years later, Israel honored him as righteous among the nations for risking his life to save Jews. Denmark awarded him their highest civilian medal. Even his own country eventually recognized his courage, though it took decades for the full story to emerge. The rescue of Danish Jewry proved that ordinary people could resist even the most powerful evil regimes. It wasn't just about Duckwitz making one brave choice. Thousands of Danes decided to help their neighbors instead of looking the other way. Not every country produced such heroes during the war's darkest moments. But across the Pacific, American medical personnel were facing their own impossible situations, treating the wounded and sick under conditions that would test every limit of human endurance. Picture working as a nurse when suddenly your entire world gets turned upside down. One day you're caring for patients in a peaceful hospital, the next you're trapped behind enemy lines with thousands of wounded soldiers depending on you. Well, that's exactly what happened to Dorothy Still in 1942. Dorothy wasn't planning to become a war hero. She was just doing her job as an army nurse in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But when the bombs started falling on her hospital, everything changed fast. Really fast. The Japanese forces swept through the Philippines like wildfire. American and Filipino troops found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of supplies. Dorothy and her fellow nurses were supposed to evacuate. They were supposed to get to safety before the enemy arrived. But here's the thing about nurses, they don't abandon their patients, ever. When the order came to retreat, Dorothy made a choice that would define the next 3 years of her life. She stayed. Along with other brave medical staff, she kept working even as Japanese soldiers marched closer to their makeshift hospital. The sound of gunfire grew louder each day, but Dorothy kept treating wounded soldiers. Then came the capture. Japanese forces overran their position, and suddenly Dorothy found herself a prisoner of war. But the weird part is, being captured didn't stop her from being a nurse. It just made her job 1,000 times harder. The Japanese commanders faced a problem. They had thousands of Allied prisoners who were sick, wounded and dying. Dead prisoners couldn't work, and they needed workers, so they made Dorothy an offer she couldn't refuse: keep the prisoners alive, and they'd let her live too. What followed was 3 years of medical miracles performed with almost nothing. Dorothy operated without proper surgical instruments. She treated infections without antibiotics. She performed surgeries using makeshift tools and whatever supplies she could scrounge up. Sometimes she used pieces of metal from bombed buildings as surgical instruments. Talk about making do with what you have. The conditions were brutal beyond belief. Food was scarce, medicine was practically non-existent, and diseases spread like wildfire through the cramped prison camps. Dorothy treated everything from malaria to dysentery to infected wounds that should have been treated in proper hospitals. Instead, she worked in bamboo huts with dirt floors and no running water. But Dorothy had something more valuable than fancy equipment. She had knowledge, determination, and an unshakable will to save lives. She taught other prisoners basic medical skills, turning clerks and mechanics into makeshift medical assistants. When one person knew how to help, suddenly she could treat twice as many patients. The Japanese guards watched her work with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They needed her skills, but they didn't trust her. Dorothy walked a dangerous line every single day. Too much success treating prisoners, and the guards might think she was making them too healthy to control. Too little success, and they might decide she wasn't worth keeping alive. Let's not forget the psychological warfare she endured. Dorothy watched fellow Americans die from diseases that could have been easily treated back home. She saw strong men waste away from malnutrition and despair. Yet she kept working, kept encouraging others, kept finding reasons to believe liberation would eventually come. The numbers tell an incredible story. During her 3 years as a prisoner, Dorothy treated thousands of Allied soldiers and civilians. Her makeshift hospitals had mortality rates far lower than anyone thought possible under those conditions. She didn't just keep people alive, she gave them hope that tomorrow might be better than today. When American forces finally liberated the Philippines in 1945, they found Dorothy still working, still treating patients, still saving lives with nothing but her hands, her brain, and her unbreakable spirit. She had survived starvation, disease, and constant danger to become a living symbol of what medical dedication really means. The liberation troops were amazed by what they found. Here was this American nurse who had essentially run a hospital system in a prison camp. She had trained dozens of medical assistants, established treatment protocols, and maintained detailed records of every patient she treated. Even as a prisoner, she had remained thoroughly professional. Dorothy returned to America as a hero, though she rarely talked about her experiences. The horrors she had witnessed, and the impossible decisions she had made were too painful to relive for entertainment. She had seen the absolute worst of humanity, but had also discovered the absolute best within herself. Her story reminds us that heroes don't always carry weapons or fly dangerous missions. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and refuse to give up on healing people, even when the whole world seems determined to destroy them. Speaking of people who used their minds as weapons against the enemy, there was another woman whose intellectual battles were just as crucial to Allied victory. Breaking codes during wartime sounds like something out of a spy movie, but one woman made it her daily reality for years. While male codebreakers often got the spotlight, Elizabeth Friedman was quietly dismantling enemy communications from her desk in Washington. She didn't just crack a few messages here and there. She led entire teams that helped turn the tide of World War II. Most people have never heard her name, which is pretty unfair considering what she accomplished. Elizabeth started her career before the war even began, working for the US Coast Guard, breaking codes used by smugglers during Prohibition. Rum runners thought they were clever with their secret messages, but she saw right through them. Little did anyone know this was just practice for something much bigger. When World War II erupted, Nazi Germany wasn't just fighting on battlefields. They were running a massive spy network throughout Latin America, trying to gather intelligence and sabotage Allied operations. German agents were sending coded messages all over South America, thinking their communications were completely secure. They were wrong. Elizabeth and her team intercepted thousands of these messages. Day after day, she would stare at seemingly random letters and numbers, looking for patterns that others missed entirely. Her mind worked like a puzzle-solving machine, finding hidden meanings in what looked like gibberish to everyone else. The weird part is that she often solved codes faster than the machines designed to help her. But here's where it gets really interesting. She wasn't just reading enemy mail. Through her code-breaking work, Elisabeth discovered an entire German spy ring operating in South America. These weren't small-time operators either. They were planning to sabotage Allied ships, steal military secrets, and coordinate attacks on American targets. Her team decoded messages that revealed Nazi agents in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. One particularly important breakthrough exposed a German spy network that was tracking Allied shipping routes. The information they were gathering could have led to devastating submarine attacks on merchant vessels carrying supplies to Britain. Thanks to Elisabeth's work, these operations were shut down before they could cause serious damage. The impact extended far beyond just catching spies. Her code-breaking helped protect the vital supply lines across the Atlantic Ocean. Those merchant ships weren't just carrying food and equipment. They were keeping Britain alive during some of the darkest days of the war. Every message she decoded potentially saved lives. Then there's the technical side of her achievements. Elisabeth developed new methods for breaking codes that hadn't been seen before. She created systems that her teams could use to tackle different types of enemy ciphers more efficiently. Her innovations became standard practice for American intelligence services, influencing how the US approached cryptography for decades afterward. What makes her story even more remarkable is how she balanced this intense work with training others. Elisabeth taught dozens of people how to break codes, passing on techniques that multiplied her impact across the entire war effort. Many of her students went on to crack crucial enemy messages in other theaters of the war. The pressure on her was enormous. Every day brought new intercepted messages that could contain life or death information. German spies were constantly changing their methods, trying to stay one step ahead of Allied code breakers. But Elisabeth seemed to thrive under this pressure, consistently finding ways to penetrate even the most sophisticated enemy codes. Her work remained classified for decades after the war ended. While other wartime heroes were getting recognition and writing memoirs, Elisabeth had to stay quiet about her contributions. The government wanted to keep their code-breaking capabilities secret, so her achievements stayed hidden in classified files. Makes sense from a security standpoint, but it meant that one of the war's most effective intelligence officers remained virtually unknown to the public. Only years later, when documents were finally declassified, did people begin to understand the scope of what she had accomplished. The ripple effects of her work extended well into the post-war period. The counterintelligence techniques she developed helped the US track Soviet communications during the early Cold War. Her methods for training new codebreakers became the foundation for entire intelligence training programs. Full recognition did eventually come, though much later than it should have. Modern cryptographers and intelligence historians now recognize Elisabeth as one of the most important figures in American intelligence history. Her techniques influenced computer-based code-breaking that came decades later. But even as Elisabeth was revolutionizing intelligence work from behind a desk, other heroes were gathering crucial information through much more dangerous methods. Some of them weren't even American citizens, yet they risked everything to help the Allied cause in ways that would remain secret for even longer than her code-breaking achievements. Most people think wartime intelligence work means fancy gadgets and suave spies. Guy Stern's reality was quite different. He carried a notebook, spoke perfect German, and had one of the most dangerous jobs in the European theater. The Nazis would have shot him on sight if they'd known his true identity. Born Günther Stern in Germany, he fled to America as a Jewish refugee in 1937. Just a few years later, he was back on European soil wearing an American uniform. The irony wasn't lost on him. The country that had rejected him was now his enemy, and his new homeland had turned him into their secret weapon. Guy joined a classified unit called the Ritchie Boys. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were refugees, immigrants, and German Americans who understood the enemy's language, culture, and psychology better than anyone else. Their training happened at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, where they learned interrogation techniques, propaganda analysis, and battlefield intelligence gathering. The weird part is how perfectly suited Guy was for this work. His childhood in Germany gave him insights that no amount of training could provide. He knew how German soldiers thought, what they feared, and which psychological pressure points would make them talk. When he questioned prisoners, he wasn't just translating words, he was reading minds. Guy's first major assignment came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces had launched a surprise counteroffensive, and Allied commanders desperately needed information about enemy positions and plans. Guy found himself on the front lines, sometimes just yards from German troops, gathering intelligence that would shape military strategy. His interrogation skills became legendary among Allied officers. While other interrogators relied on threats or promises, Guy used something more powerful: understanding. He could identify which prisoners were committed Nazis and which were just scared kids who wanted to go home. Makes sense, right? He'd been one of those scared kids himself, just on the other side. One captured German officer later described Guy's questioning technique as disturbingly effective. Guy would start conversations about hometown foods, local dialects, or family traditions. Before prisoners realized what was happening, they'd revealed unit strengths, officer names, and strategic plans. He never needed to raise his voice or make threats. His approach was almost conversational, but Guy's work went beyond simple interrogation. He analyzed captured documents, translated intercepted radio transmissions, and created psychological profiles of German commanders. His reports helped Allied forces predict enemy movements and exploit weaknesses in German defenses. Intelligence officers called his assessments uncannily accurate. The danger was constant and personal. If captured, Guy faced execution not just as an enemy soldier, but as a Jewish refugee who'd returned to fight against the Reich. He carried forged papers identifying him as a regular American soldier, but his accent and cultural knowledge made him valuable enough to take enormous risks. Sometimes he'd venture into recently captured towns to question civilians and gather local intelligence. Guy's team played a crucial role in the final push into Germany. They identified which German units were likely to surrender and which would fight to the death. This intelligence saved thousands of Allied lives by allowing commanders to focus their strongest attacks where resistance would be fiercest. Military historians later credited the Ritchie Boys with shortening the war by several months. Then there's the psychological impact of Guy's work. Many German prisoners were shocked to encounter Jewish soldiers who spoke flawless German and understood their culture intimately. Some prisoners initially refused to believe that Jewish refugees had returned as American soldiers. This cognitive dissonance often made them more cooperative during questioning. After Germany's surrender, Guy's work continued. He helped identify war criminals, locate hidden Nazi assets, and rebuild German civil institutions under Allied occupation. His unique background made him invaluable during the transition from wartime to peacetime governance. He understood both the enemy's mindset and America's democratic values. The Ritchie Boys' contributions remained classified for decades after the war ended. Guy couldn't discuss his service with family members or researchers. Official recognition came slowly, often only after documents were declassified years later. Many of his fellow Ritchie Boys died without receiving public acknowledgement for their contributions. Guy eventually became a professor, teaching German literature and sharing his knowledge of European culture with new generations, but he rarely discussed his wartime intelligence work. Students knew him as an expert on German poetry and drama, not as someone who'd helped defeat Nazi Germany through psychological warfare. His story represents thousands of refugees who returned to fight against the countries that had expelled them. These men and women possessed unique advantages in gathering intelligence and understanding enemy behavior. Their personal experiences with persecution made them particularly effective at identifying the psychological weaknesses of fascist regimes. Guy's legacy extends beyond his individual contributions to Allied victory. He proved that immigrants and refugees often become a nation's most dedicated defenders, bringing skills and perspectives that native-born citizens might lack. Or while Guy was using his intellect to defeat Germany through psychological warfare, other heroes were taking to the skies with an entirely different approach to lifting spirits during wartime. Or while most war stories focus on battles and bullets, sometimes the most powerful weapons are chocolate bars and candy. Meet Lieutenant Gail Halvorson, the man who proved that dropping sweets from the sky could be just as important as dropping bombs. The year was 1948. Berlin lay in ruins, carved up like a bitter cake among the Allied powers. But here's where things got complicated. The Soviets decided to blockade West Berlin completely. No trucks, no trains, no supplies, nothing. They wanted to starve the city into submission, forcing the Western Allies to abandon their sectors. The Berlin airlift began as a desperate response, cargo planes flying around the clock, delivering everything from coal to milk powder to keep 2 million people alive. Halvorson was just another transport pilot in this massive operation. Day after day, he'd fly his C-54 Skymaster into Tempelhof Airport, unload supplies and head back. Routine stuff. Well, as routine as landing in a city surrounded by hostile forces could be. Then one ordinary afternoon changed everything. Halvorson was walking near the airport fence when he spotted a group of German children watching the planes. These weren't the enemy kids he'd been taught to fear during the war. They were just hungry. Curious faces pressed against the wire. Many wore patched clothes and shoes held together with string. The war had ended 3 years earlier, but its scars were everywhere. What happened next sounds almost too simple to matter. Halvorson reached into his pocket and found 2 sticks of doublemint gum. He handed them through the fence to the children. 30 kids crowded around, but instead of fighting over the gum, they did something unexpected. The 2 lucky ones carefully tore the wrapper into strips, passing them around so everyone could smell the sweet mint scent. That reaction hit Halvorson like a freight train. These children were so grateful for the tiniest gesture of kindness that they shared even the wrapper. Right there, he made them a promise that would change his life. Tomorrow, he'd drop candy from his plane. But how would they know which plane was his? Halvorson told them to watch for the pilot who wiggled his wings. From that day forward, he became known as Uncle Wiggly Wings to the children of Berlin. The next day, Halvorson attached 3 handkerchiefs to some chocolate bars and Wrigley's gum, then dropped them near the airport fence during his approach. The children went wild. Word spread faster than wildfire through the bombed-out neighborhoods. Soon, hundreds of kids gathered daily to watch for the plane that wiggled its wings. Letters started pouring in, thousands of them. Children wrote in broken English, asking for drops near their homes, their schools, their neighborhoods. Some drew pictures of airplanes with parachutes. Others sent thank you notes that would make grown men cry. One letter simply said, "When I see your plane, I know somebody cares about me." The operation grew beyond anything Halvorson imagined. Fellow pilots started joining in, donating their own candy rations. American school children heard about the candy bomber and began massive donation drives. Chocolate manufacturers sent cases of candy bars. Parachute companies donated miniature chutes. Even Halvorson's commanding officers, initially skeptical, threw their support behind the mission. The logistics became increasingly complex. Halvorson and his crew spent hours after flights making tiny parachutes from handkerchiefs, napkins, and strips of cloth. They'd attach candy bars, gum, and sometimes small toys. Each flight became a carefully planned candy drop, with children marking safe landing zones throughout the city. Over the course of the airlift, Halvorson and his fellow candy bombers dropped more than 23 tons of sweets to Berlin's children. The psychological impact was immeasurable. These weren't just treats falling from the sky, they were symbols of hope, friendship, and a better future. Children who had known only war and destruction suddenly had reason to smile and wave at Allied aircraft. The Berlin airlift itself proved successful. After 324 days, the Soviets lifted their blockade, unable to break the will of West Berliners or the determination of Allied pilots. But Halvorson's candy drops accomplished something equally important. They transformed the narrative from occupiers and occupied to friends and neighbors. Years later, many of those Berlin children would credit Halvorson with showing them that Americans weren't conquerors, but liberators who cared about their well-being. Some became lifelong advocates for German-American friendship. Others pursued careers inspired by that kindness they witnessed as kids. The candy bomber proved that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes. While politicians negotiated and generals strategized, one pilot with a pocket full of gum showed an entire city that hope could literally fall from the sky. But Berlin wasn't the only place where incredible survival stories were unfolding in the aftermath of war. Imagine fleeing through frozen wilderness with no toes on your feet, Nazi soldiers hunting you, and nothing but raw determination keeping you alive. Jan Balsrud didn't have to imagine it. He lived it. March 1943. Balsrud and 11 other Norwegian resistance fighters set out on a secret mission called Operation Martin. Their job? Blow up a German airfield and disrupt Nazi operations in northern Norway. Simple plan. What could go wrong? Everything. The mission went sideways faster than a penguin on ice. German forces spotted their boat before they even reached shore. Within hours, 10 of Balsrud's companions were dead. One was captured. That left Jan alone, wounded and deep in enemy territory with half the German army looking for him. But here's where things get interesting. Most people would surrender. Balsrud decided to run through the Norwegian wilderness. In winter, with a bullet in his foot, the man had clearly lost his mind. Or maybe he'd found something most of us never discover. For the next 2 months, Balsrud played the world's deadliest game of hide-and-seek across the frozen landscape of northern Norway. He crawled through snow so deep it could swallow a house. He hid in caves that turned his breath to ice crystals. When German patrols got too close, he buried himself in snowdrifts and waited them out. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was murderous. His toes began turning black from frostbite. Not just a little black. Coal black, dead tissue that would kill him if infection spread. So what did this madman do? He took out his knife and cut off 9 of his own toes. without anesthesia, without proper tools. Just a man, a blade, and willpower that defied human understanding. Blood poisoning set in anyway. His body temperature dropped so low he should have died a dozen times over. German search parties swept the area daily, using dogs and aircraft to track him down. Every footprint in the snow could mean death. Every sound could bring enemy soldiers running. Then there were the locals who helped him. Norwegian civilians who risked execution to keep one resistance fighter alive. They found him snow caves, delirious and barely breathing. They fed him, gave him shelter, passed him from family to family like a precious secret that could get them all killed. One family hid him in their barn for weeks, while German soldiers searched house by house. Another group of villagers built a makeshift stretcher and carried him across miles of frozen terrain when he couldn't walk anymore. These weren't trained soldiers or special agents. They were farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers who decided one man's life was worth risking everything. The weird part is how Balzard kept his sense of humor through it all. Years later, he joked that losing his toes actually made him a better skier. Less weight on his feet, he claimed. The man survived 2 months of hell and came out cracking jokes about it. Spring finally arrived, and with it came Balzard's chance to escape across the border into neutral Sweden. But even that nearly killed him. The final stretch required crossing a frozen lake under cover of darkness, with German patrols on both sides. One wrong step through thin ice would mean drowning. One glimpse from an enemy searchlight would mean bullets. He made it by crawling on his belly across the ice for hours, pulling himself forward with his fingernails when his strength gave out. When Swedish border guards found him, he was more corpse than man, 90 pounds of skin and bones, and absolute refusal to quit. But Balzard's story didn't end with his escape. It was just beginning. His survival became legend throughout occupied Norway. Resistance fighters told his story in whispered conversations, passing it from cell to cell like ammunition for the soul. If Jon Balzard could survive 2 months in frozen hell with no toes and a bullet wound, what excuse did anyone else have for giving up? The Nazis put a massive bounty on his head, but he'd already slipped away. From Sweden he made his way to Britain, where he trained other resistance fighters and planned new operations against German forces. The man who should have died a dozen times over was back in the fight within months. After the war, Balzard became a symbol of Norwegian resistance. Books were written about his escape. Movies were made. School children learned his name alongside their national heroes. He'd earned it the hard way, one frozen step at a time. His story spread beyond Norway too, inspiring resistance movements across occupied Europe. If a single man could survive the impossible, maybe entire nations could outlast their occupiers. But Jon Balzard wasn't the only Allied agent whose story would become the stuff of legend in occupied territory. Across the channel in Paris, another resistance hero was about to face her own impossible odds. While most spies operated in shadows, Noor Inayat Khan worked under the brightest spotlight imaginable, right in the heart of Nazi-occupied Paris, broadcasting secret radio messages that could get her shot on the spot. Born to an Indian Sufi mystic father and an American mother, Noor seemed like an unlikely candidate for espionage work. She wrote children's stories, played the harp. Her friends described her as gentle, almost dreamy, the kind of person who'd rescue injured birds and spend hours reading poetry. But when the Nazis invaded France, this soft-spoken woman made a decision that would shock everyone who knew her. She volunteered for the most dangerous job in the British intelligence service, wireless operator in occupied territory. The life expectancy: 6 weeks if you were lucky. Most got caught within days. Here's the thing about radio work during wartime saying. It was basically painting a target on your back. Every time you transmitted, German detection vans prowled the streets with equipment designed to pinpoint your exact location. They'd triangulate your signal like hunting dogs following a scent. The longer you stayed on air, the closer they got. Noor knew this. Everyone warned her. Yet in June 1943, she parachuted into France anyway, carrying a suitcase radio and the codename Madeleine. What made her situation even more perilous was timing. Within weeks of her arrival, the Gestapo smashed her entire network. Every other agent in her circuit got captured or killed. Suddenly, Noor found herself the only working radio link between London and the French resistance in the Paris area. Any sensible person would have run. Instead, she kept broadcasting. For months she moved constantly around Paris. Attics, basements, abandoned buildings, anywhere she could set up her antenna and tap out coded messages. She'd transmit intelligence about German troop movements, coordinate supply drops, and relay instructions to resistance fighters, all while dodging detection vans that circled the city like sharks. The weird part is how she pulled it off for so long. Noor looked nothing like the typical French woman. Her exotic features made her stand out in crowds. She spoke French with a slight accent, yet she managed to blend into occupied Paris like a ghost. Her handlers back in London grew increasingly worried. They kept offering to extract her, but she refused every time. The resistance needed her radio link. Without it, operations would collapse and lives would be lost. Then there's the betrayal that finally brought her down. In October 1943, a French woman sold Noor's location to the Gestapo for the bounty money. Classic wartime treachery, neighbors turning on neighbors for cold cash. When the Germans burst into her apartment, they expected to find documents, code books, maybe some resistance contacts. Instead, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. Noor had kept detailed records of every transmission, every operation, every secret she'd handled over 4 months in Paris. But here's where her story becomes legendary. Despite having enough evidence to destroy the entire French resistance network, despite facing interrogation techniques that broke hardened soldiers, Noor never revealed a single operational detail, not one name, not one location, nothing. The Gestapo tried everything. Psychological pressure, physical torture, promises of freedom. She gave them exactly what international law required. Name, rank, serial number. That's it. For nearly a year in various prisons, she maintained complete silence about her work. Her captors grew so frustrated, they classified her as highly dangerous and kept her in solitary confinement. They'd never encountered a prisoner who combined such apparent gentleness with such unbreakable resolve. What drove this children's book author to such extraordinary courage? Letters she managed to smuggle out suggest it came from her spiritual beliefs. She saw resistance work as a sacred duty, protecting innocent people from evil. Her Sufi background taught that truth and justice were worth any personal sacrifice. In September 1944, as Allied forces approached Paris, the Germans transferred Noor to Dachau concentration camp. They knew liberation was coming, and wanted to eliminate witnesses who knew too much about their operations. On September 13, 1944, Noor Inayat Khan was executed by firing squad. Her last word, according to witnesses, was liberté, notre freedom in French. She was 30 years old. After the war, British intelligence pieced together the full scope of her contribution. During those crucial months as the sole radio operator in Paris, she transmitted intelligence that helped coordinate the D-Day preparations. Her reports on German defences and troop dispositions proved invaluable for invasion planning. The British government awarded her the George Cross, their highest civilian honour for bravery. France gave her the Croix de Guerre. Both citations emphasized the same point. She could have saved herself at any time but chose to stay and fight. But recognition wasn't what drove Noor Inayat Khan. Like many wartime heroes, her motivation came from something deeper than medals or glory. Sometimes the gentlest souls prove capable of the greatest courage when evil forces them to choose sides. Speaking of choosing sides under impossible circumstances, another hero made decisions that would save thousands while risking everything his own country stood for. Most Americans of Japanese descent found themselves locked away in internment camps during World War II. But Daniel Inchoi chose a different path. He volunteered to fight for the very country that had imprisoned his neighbors and questioned his loyalty. Talk about complicated feelings, right? Here's a guy whose fellow Japanese Americans were being treated like enemies, and he decides to pick up a rifle and charge straight into Nazi machine gun fire. The 442nd Infantry Regiment became the most decorated unit in American military history. No pressure there. Inoue grew up in Hawaii, where being Japanese didn't automatically make you suspicious. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Suddenly, anyone with Japanese features became a potential spy. The mainland locked up entire families behind barbed wire. Hawaii couldn't do the same thing without destroying its economy, but the suspicion was thick enough to cut with a knife. When the military finally allowed Japanese Americans to serve, thousands volunteered. They had something to prove. The 442nd Regiment got the worst assignments, the most dangerous missions, the places where other units had already failed. Military commanders figured these soldiers would either prove their loyalty or die trying. Well, they proved it all right. but the cost was brutal. Inouye's unit shipped out to Europe in 1943. Their motto was "Go for broke," which basically meant risk everything on one big gamble. They fought in Italy first, then France. Every battle was a chance to show America they belonged. Every wounded soldier was proof of their commitment. The weird part is how the military used them. Need someone to charge up an impossible hill. Send the 442nd. Need a unit to break through heavily fortified positions. The Japanese Americans will do it. They became the go-to guys for suicide missions that somehow kept succeeding. In October 1944, the 442nd got orders to rescue the Lost Battalion. A Texas unit was trapped behind German lines in the Vosges Mountains of France. Previous rescue attempts had failed miserably. The Texans were running out of ammunition, food and hope. The 442nd attacked through dense forest against entrenched German positions. They faced machine gun nests, artillery barrages, and sniper fire from every direction. For 5 days they pushed forward. The casualty rate was staggering. Some companies lost 80% of their men. Then there's what happened to Inoue personally. During one battle in Italy, he was leading his platoon up a ridge when German machine guns opened fire. 3 bullets hit him in the stomach. He kept fighting. A grenade exploded near his right elbow, nearly severing his arm. He pulled the pin on his own grenade with his left hand and threw it at the German position, but his arm was hanging by threads of skin and muscle. A medic ran up to help him, and Inoue reportedly said, "Nobody called for a medic." He refused treatment until his men had secured the position. When they finally got him to a field hospital, doctors had to amputate his right arm. Most soldiers would have gone home after losing an arm. Inoue wanted to stay and fight. The military said no. Obviously, he'd done enough, more than enough. The 442nd Regiment earned over 18,000 individual decorations during the war. That's more awards than they had soldiers. Purple Hearts were so common that guys joked about collecting them like trading cards. 21 members received the Medal of Honor, though most of those weren't awarded until decades later. After the war, Inoue went to law school. One armed guy becomes a lawyer, then gets into politics. He represented Hawaii in Congress before it was even a state, then became one of its first senators when statehood came through. He served in the Senate for nearly 50 years. The recognition took forever to arrive. In 2000, President Clinton finally awarded Inoue the Medal of Honor for his actions in Italy. He was 76 years old, better late than never, but still, the ceremony was emotional enough to make grown generals cry. What makes Inouye's story different from other war heroes? He fought for a country that didn't fully trust him. His unit proved their loyalty with blood, while their families sat behind barbed wire. In American detention camps, they earned respect the hard way, one bullet at a time. The 442nd changed how America saw Japanese Americans. Before the war, prejudice was legal and common. After seeing what these soldiers accomplished, it became harder to question their patriotism. Not impossible, but harder. Inouye's journey from battlefield to Senate chamber shows how one person can reshape entire conversations about identity and belonging. His war wounds never fully healed, but his determination to serve never wavered. Speaking of determination under impossible circumstances, the Soviet Union had its own warriors who refused to let physical limitations stop them from fighting back against the Nazi war machine. While most pilots trained for years to master their aircraft, these women got maybe a few weeks. Their planes were so old that some dated back to World War I. No radios, no parachutes, no armor plating, just canvas wings, open cockpits, and nerves of steel. The Soviet Union's 588th Night Bomber Regiment became known by a name that struck fear into German hearts: the Night Witches. Marina Raskova had convinced Stalin himself to let women fly combat missions. By 1942, 3 all-female aviation regiments took to the skies, but the night bombers got the worst equipment and the most dangerous job, flying in rickety Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes that looked more like crop dusters than military aircraft. These planes were so flimsy that machine gun bullets could pass right through the canvas without exploding. Actually turned out to be an advantage sometimes. The Po-2's maximum speed was slower than the stall speed of German fighters, which meant Messerschmitts couldn't slow down enough to shoot them without falling out of the sky themselves. Well, that didn't make the missions any less terrifying. The Night Witches would glide toward their targets with engines cut, wings whistling through the darkness. German soldiers said the sound reminded them of witches' broomsticks sweeping through the night, hence the nickname that these women wore like a badge of honor. Nadezhda Popova flew 852 combat missions. That's more than most male pilots flew in the entire war. She once had her plane shot up so badly that it was held together by prayer and stubbornness, but she still made it back to base. Another time, she crash-landed behind enemy lines and had to hide in a swamp for hours while German patrols searched for her. Then there was Lydia Litviak, who wasn't part of the night bombers but flew with the female fighter regiment. She shot down 12 German planes and became known as the White Rose of Stalingrad. Her plane had a white lily painted on the side and she wore silk scarves into combat, because apparently looking fabulous while shooting down Nazis was important too. The night bombing missions were psychological warfare at its finest. The Night Witches would approach in formations of 3. 2 planes would draw searchlights and anti-aircraft fire while the third snuck in to drop bombs. They'd take turns keeping German troops awake all night with constant harassment attacks. Sleep deprivation became a serious problem for Wehrmacht forces on the Eastern Front. These women often flew multiple missions per night. Some completed over 10 sorties in a single evening. Their planes could only carry 2 small bombs at a time, so they had to make trip after trip to cause real damage. Like the world's deadliest pizza delivery service. But instead of pepperoni they brought high explosives. Let's not forget the conditions they endured. Open cockpits meant flying in temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Ice would form on their faces and hands. Their maps would freeze solid. Some pilots developed frostbite so severe they lost fingers and toes. But here's the remarkable part. They kept flying anyway. Irina Sabrova holds the record for most combat missions by any pilot in history, male or female. She flew 1,008 sorties and dropped over 200,000 kilograms of bombs on German targets. When asked years later how she managed it, she simply said flying was better than staying on the ground where the real danger was. The Night Witches faced discrimination even from their own side initially. Male Soviet pilots doubted women could handle combat operations. Crews weren't sure how to interact with female aviators. Some commanders tried to assign them to safer reconnaissance missions instead of bombing runs. Wrong move. These women proved themselves night after night, mission after mission. By war's end, the 588th Regiment had flown over 23,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs. They lost 32 aircraft in combat, which was actually a remarkably low casualty rate considering the dangers they faced. Their success came from skill, courage, and the element of surprise that came from flying planes everyone assumed were obsolete. 23 Night Witches received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, their country's highest military honor. But recognition came slowly. For decades after the war, their stories remained largely untold outside the Soviet Union. These women proved that heroism doesn't require the latest equipment or perfect conditions. Sometimes the most effective warriors are the ones everyone underestimates, flying through darkness with determination that no amount of firepower can match. Speaking of underestimated fighters, courage during wartime wasn't limited to the skies or even to adults. Picture a 19-year-old girl walking down a street in Nazi-occupied France, casual as can be. She's got blonde hair, bright eyes, and looks like she couldn't hurt a fly. The German soldiers barely glance at her. Big mistake. Hidden under her innocent appearance, grenades, ammunition, and a determination that would make seasoned fighters jealous. Meet Simone Seguin, codenamed Nicole. While most teenagers worried about school dances, she was busy blowing up Nazi supply lines. Her story started in 1944, when she was just 18. The Germans had occupied her hometown of Thifars for 4 years. Most people kept their heads down, hoping to survive until liberation came. Not Simone. She looked around at the jackbooted soldiers strutting through her streets and thought, not on my watch. The local resistance didn't take her seriously at first. Can you blame them? She looked like she belonged in a Sunday school class. Not a guerrilla war, but appearances deceived everyone back then. The resistance leader finally agreed to let her prove herself, with a simple mission. Simple turned out to be relative when you're dealing with Nazis. Her first job involved carrying messages between resistance cells. Boring stuff, right? Well, try walking past German checkpoints with secret communications tucked in your underwear. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and you're facing a firing squad before breakfast. Simone made it look easy. Then came the real action. The resistance needed someone to scout German positions near a railway line they planned to sabotage. Someone young and innocent looking, who could walk around without raising suspicion. Simone volunteered immediately. She spent days mapping patrol routes, counting soldiers, and noting weak points in their defenses. The information she gathered helped the resistance pull off their most successful railway sabotage yet. Dozens of German supply trains got derailed over the following weeks. The Nazis were furious but had no idea a teenager was behind their headaches. But Simone wasn't content playing messenger and scout. She wanted to carry a gun and fight alongside the men. The resistance leaders laughed at first. This girl wanted to engage in actual combat against battle-hardened German troops. The laughter stopped when she proved she could outshoot half the team. Her biggest moment came during the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Allied forces were pushing toward the city, but the Germans weren't giving up without a fight. Street battles erupted across the capital as resistance fighters emerged from hiding to support the advancing troops. Simone found herself in the thick of it, armed with a German submachine gun she'd taken from a captured soldier. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mars using Nazi weapons against Nazis. She fought street by street, building by building, helping clear German positions ahead of the Allied advance. A war correspondent spotted her during the fighting and snapped a photograph. There she was, 19 years old, wearing a dress and carrying that submachine gun like it weighed nothing. The image became iconic, youth and determination personified in the face of tyranny. The weird part is how naturally she adapted to combat. Most people freeze up in their first firefight. Simone seemed to thrive on it. She moved through the urban battlefield with confidence that impressed even veteran fighters. Her small size actually helped Newthus. She could slip through spaces that would trap larger soldiers. During one particularly intense battle, her unit got pinned down by German machine gun fire. The position had them trapped for hours, picking off anyone who tried to move. Simone studied the situation and noticed something others missed. A narrow alley that curved behind the German position. She volunteered to circle around alone and attack from the rear. Her commanders thought it was suicide, but they were running out of options. Simone slipped away during a lull in the firing and disappeared into the maze of Parisian side streets. 20 minutes later, the German machine gun fell silent. Simone had approached from behind and eliminated the entire position single-handedly. When her unit reached her, she was calmly reloading her weapon and checking the area for useful supplies. That kind of cool-headed action under pressure became her trademark. She participated in multiple operations during the liberation, always volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. Her youth worked perfectly as camouflage. Who suspects a teenage girl of being a deadly resistance fighter? After Paris fell to Allied forces, Simone continued fighting as the war moved into Germany itself. She'd proven that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, often when you least expect them. Her courage inspired other young French citizens to join the resistance during those final months of occupation. Speaking of unexpected heroes, there was another person whose heroism came from an entirely different place. Not a battlefield in Europe, but from behind a diplomat's desk thousands of miles away, where someone was quietly saving lives through the simple stroke of a pen. In 1940, a Japanese diplomat named Shunni Sugihara sat at his desk in Lithuania, staring at a cable from Tokyo. His government had just ordered him to stop issuing transit visas to Jewish refugees. The message was clear: follow orders or face severe consequences. Sugihara crumpled the telegram and threw it in the trash. What happened next would save thousands of lives and cost him everything he'd worked for. But here's the thing about real heroes. They don't calculate the cost when people are dying. Outside his consulate in Kaunas, hundreds of desperate families had been gathering for weeks. Men clutching their children, women with whatever belongings they could carry, all of them fleeing the Nazi war machine that was swallowing Europe piece by piece. They needed one thing: a visa that would let them escape through Japan to safety. The Japanese Foreign Ministry had made their position crystal clear. No more visas for Jews. Period. Sugihara was supposed to pack up and leave for his next assignment in Berlin. Yes, Berlin, right into the heart of Nazi territory. Instead, he did something that would have made his superiors absolutely furious if they'd known. He kept writing visas, day after day, hour after hour. His hand cramped from signing so many documents that his wife Yukiko had to massage his fingers so he could continue. The weird part is how methodical he was about defying orders. Sugihara wasn't some rebel throwing caution to the wind. He was a career diplomat who understood exactly what insubordination meant for his future. Yet, every morning, he'd unlock the consulate doors and face the growing crowd of refugees. His wife later described watching him work through the night by lamplight, signature after signature. each one a lifeline, each one another nail in the coffin of his diplomatic career. The man was literally writing his way out of a job to save strangers. Then there's the brilliant part of his strategy. Japanese transit visas weren't permanent residence permits, they just allowed passage through Japan. Technically, refugees needed final destinations lined up before Japan would let them through. But Sugihara started issuing visas to people who had nowhere else to go, figuring they'd sort out the details once they reached safety. Well, it worked. Sort of. Many visa holders did make it to Japan, where they discovered that Japanese immigration officials weren't exactly thrilled about this flood of unexpected arrivals their own diplomat had created. But by then these refugees were out of Nazi reach. That's what mattered. Word spread through the refugee networks. Families traveled for days just to reach Sugihara's consulate. The line outside grew longer, instead of shorter, even as his departure date approached. His superiors kept sending increasingly angry cables demanding he wrap up and leave immediately. Sugihara's response: he requested a visa extension for himself. Makes sense, right? If you're going to defy the government, might as well be thorough about it. But the foreign ministry wasn't having it. They ordered him to close the consulate and report to Berlin without delay. So here's what this man did in his final hours in Lithuania. He continued writing visas at the train station. Even as his luggage was being loaded onto the train to Germany, Sugihara was still signing documents and handing them through the window to refugees who'd followed him there. The last thing he did before the train pulled away was throw his official consulate stamp to someone in the crowd. That stamp could be used to validate more visas, even after he was gone. After the war, researchers tried to count how many people Sugihara's visas saved. The number keeps growing as more stories surface. Conservative estimates suggest around 6,000 lives. But each of those people had families, and those families had children, and those children had children. Today, tens of thousands of people exist because one Japanese diplomat decided his conscience mattered more than his career. The Japanese government wasn't exactly throwing him parades when he returned home. They fired him from the foreign ministry and made sure he'd never work in government again. For decades, Sugihara took whatever jobs he could find to support his family. His heroic actions remained largely unknown outside the communities he'd saved, but the people he rescued never forgot. In 1985, Israel honored him as righteous among the nations, their highest recognition for non-Jews who risked everything to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. What strikes you about Sugihara's story isn't just the scale of his rescue operation, but how he managed it under such impossible circumstances. Working within a system designed to prevent exactly what he was doing, surrounded by officials who would have stopped him instantly if they'd known. Yet even Sugihara's remarkable operation pales beside some of the physical courage displayed by other unsung heroes. Take a Soviet pilot who refused to let losing both his legs end his war. Most people would quit flying after losing both legs. But then again, most people weren't Alexei Meresiev. This Soviet pilot turned what should have been a career-ending tragedy into one of the most incredible comeback stories of World War II. March 1942 started like any other mission for Meresiev. He climbed into his fighter plane, ready to take on German aircraft over the Novgorod region. The 25-year-old had already proven himself as a skilled pilot. What happened next would test every ounce of his determination. German fighters jumped him during the mission. His plane took heavy fire and went down hard in the frozen wilderness. The crash should have killed him instantly. Instead, Meresiev found himself trapped in enemy territory, with 2 badly mangled legs, and no way to call for help. Here's where the story gets wild. He crawled through snow and ice for 18 days. 18 days. His legs were so badly frostbitten that gangrene set in. He survived on berries, bark, and sheer stubbornness. Local villagers finally found him more dead than alive. The doctors delivered the news nobody wants to hear. Both legs had to go. They amputated below the knees, figuring his flying days were over. After all, how do you work rudder pedals without feet? The medical team probably thought they were saving his life, not realizing they were about to witness something extraordinary. But Meresiev had other plans. While recovering in the hospital, he started exercising obsessively. He learned to walk on prosthetic legs, made of wood and metal. The artificial limbs were crude by today's standards, basically chunks of wood attached to metal joints. They were heavy, uncomfortable, and painful to use. Most pilots would have accepted a ground job, maybe become an instructor, or work in aircraft maintenance. Not this guy. He pestered every official he could find, demanding to return to combat duty. The bureaucrats kept saying no. Flying required perfect physical condition, and pilots with prosthetic legs simply didn't exist in military manuals. Then there's the technical challenge nobody talks about. Fighter planes in 1942 weren't designed for disabled pilots. The rudder pedals required precise foot control during combat maneuvers. One wrong move meant death. Meresiev had to completely relearn how to fly using artificial legs that couldn't feel the pedals. He practiced in secret whenever possible. Other pilots watched in amazement as he adapted his technique. He developed new ways to sense the aircraft's movement through his remaining leg muscles and body position. The man essentially rewrote the rules of combat flying. Military officials finally agreed to let him attempt a test flight in early 1943. They probably expected him to fail spectacularly and give up the crazy dream. Instead, Meresiev not only flew successfully, but performed advanced combat maneuvers that impressed seasoned instructors. His return to active duty shocked everyone. Here was a double amputee outflying pilots with all their original parts. He developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements and position his aircraft perfectly for attacks. The proof came during actual combat missions. Meresiev shot down 7 German aircraft after his return to duty. 7 confirmed kills while flying on prosthetic legs. Enemy pilots had no idea they were being outfought by someone missing both feet. Word of his achievements spread throughout the Soviet military. Fellow pilots nicknamed him the Legless Ace. His story became legendary among aircrews who faced their own injuries and setbacks. If Meresiev could return to combat after losing his legs, maybe their own problems weren't insurmountable. The psychological impact on German forces was significant too. Imagine learning that Soviet pilots were so determined they'd return to combat even after losing limbs. It reinforced the image of an enemy that simply wouldn't quit, no matter what. Soviet authorities eventually recognized his extraordinary service. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the country's highest honor. But the real recognition came from fellow pilots who respected his skill and determination. His story inspired author Boris Polvoy to write The Story of a Real Man, which became one of the Soviet Union's most famous war novels. The book sold millions of copies and turned Meresiev into a national symbol of perseverance. Schools taught children about the pilot who wouldn't let missing legs stop him from serving his country. After the war, Meresiev continued advocating for disabled veterans. He understood the challenges they faced and worked to improve their treatment and opportunities. His own success proved that physical limitations didn't have to end meaningful careers. The weird part is how his story parallels other forgotten heroes who overcame seemingly impossible obstacles. Like that British agent who kept her secrets despite torture. Each found ways to push beyond normal human limits when everything mattered most. Speaking of pushing boundaries, another forgotten figure used her celebrity status in completely unexpected ways to fight the Nazi regime. Most people think of Josephine Baker as the glamorous entertainer who danced with bananas around her waist in 1920s Paris. The jazz age icon who captivated audiences with her wild performances and infectious smile. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This same woman became one of France's most valuable spies during World War II. When the Nazis invaded France in 1940, Baker had a choice. She could flee to safety in America, where her fame guaranteed comfort and security. Instead, she picked up a pen and signed with French intelligence. "Why, France made me who I am," she said. "I will give her all I have." Baker's celebrity status became her greatest weapon. Think about it, who suspects the famous singer of carrying military secrets? She attended embassy parties, chatted with German officers, and smiled sweetly while memorizing troop movements. The woman who once shocked conservative audiences was now using that same boldness to outsmart Nazi intelligence. Her method was brilliant in its simplicity. Baker wrote intelligence reports in invisible ink on her sheet music. Enemy positions, supply routes, submarine locations, all hidden between the notes of her songs. When border guards searched her luggage, they saw nothing but musical arrangements. The secrets traveled with her from country to country, disguised as entertainment. Then there's the matter of her chateau. Baker transformed her grand estate in the French countryside into a refuge for resistance fighters and Jewish families. She housed dozens of people fleeing Nazi persecution, providing food, shelter, and false documents. Her property became a crucial stop on escape routes leading to neutral countries. Baker's cover was nearly perfect. She performed for audiences that included high-ranking German officials, gathering intelligence while they applauded her performances. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same Nazis who considered her racially inferior were unknowingly funding their own defeat by attending her shows. But the real genius lay in her international connections. Baker used her concert tours as intelligence-gathering missions across North Africa and Europe. She met with Allied commanders, carried coded messages between resistance cells and reported German military activities from multiple countries. Her fame opened doors that remained locked to traditional spies. The risks were enormous. One intercepted message could have meant torture and execution. One suspicious German officer could have exposed her entire operation. Baker knew this, yet she continued performing her double life with remarkable courage. She even recruited other entertainers to join the resistance network, turning the entertainment industry into an unlikely intelligence apparatus. Her work extended beyond espionage. Baker used her fame to raise funds for French soldiers' families and war orphans. She organized benefit concerts, donated her earnings to the resistance, and personally distributed supplies to those in need. The woman who had once been criticized for her extravagant lifestyle was now giving everything to the war effort. What makes Baker's story even more remarkable is how she balanced her dangerous secret work with her public persona. She couldn't let audiences see the strain or fear. Every performance had to maintain the illusion of carefree entertainment, while she carried life or death information. The emotional toll must have been crushing, yet she never wavered. After the war ended, the French government finally acknowledged Baker's contributions. They awarded her the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration, along with the Croix de Guerre and the Rosette of the Resistance. But for years her wartime service remained largely unknown to the public. People still saw her as just an entertainer. Baker's story reveals something profound about courage. It doesn't always come in military uniforms or dramatic battlefield moments. Sometimes it arrives wearing sequins and a smile, carrying sheet music filled with secrets that could change the course of history. Her weapons weren't guns or grenades, they were charm, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to freedom. The entertainment world lost more than just a performer when Baker died in 1975. It lost a reminder that artists can be warriors too, that creativity and courage often walk hand in hand. Her legacy challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and recognize heroism in unexpected places. While Baker dazzled audiences with her performances, other unlikely heroes were taking different approaches to resistance. Some were barely old enough to understand the full weight of their actions, yet they chose to fight back against tyranny in ways that would shock both enemies and allies alike. Most teenagers rebel by staying out past curfew or arguing with their parents about homework. But some German teenagers during World War II chose a different kind of rebellion. They called themselves the Edelweiss Pirates, and instead of sneaking out to meet friends, they were sneaking out to sabotage Nazi railways and distribute underground newspapers that could get them executed. The name sounds almost romantic, doesn't it? Like some adventure club you'd read about in a storybook. Well, the reality was far more dangerous than any fairy tale. These weren't your typical teenage troublemakers. They were kids who looked at the Nazi regime controlling every aspect of their lives and decided they'd rather risk death than live under Hitler's boot. Here's what makes their story so remarkable. While other resistance groups operated from outside Germany or in occupied territories, the Edelweiss Pirates were fighting the beast from inside its own belly. They lived in Nazi Germany, went to Nazi schools, and walked past Nazi propaganda posters every single day. Yet somehow, they found the courage to say no. The group started in the late 1930s in cities like Cologne, Düsseldorf, and Essen. Most members were between 14 and 18 years old. They came from working-class families who had watched the Nazis destroy trade unions and crush anyone who dared to speak up. These teenagers had grown up seeing their older brothers and fathers forced into military service or factory work. They witnessed Jewish neighbors disappear overnight. But here's the twist that made them particularly clever. The Edelweiss Pirates used the Nazis' own youth programs against them. While other kids were joining the Hitler Youth, these rebels pretended to go along with the system during the day. Then at night, they became ghosts, moving through their cities like shadows. Their methods were surprisingly sophisticated for a bunch of teenagers. They developed their own communication networks, passing messages through seemingly innocent conversations at school or work. They created safe houses where they could meet and plan operations. Some members even learned basic explosives training from older resistance fighters who had managed to evade capture. The railway sabotage was their specialty. Germany's entire war machine depended on trains to move troops, weapons and supplies to the front lines. The Edelweiss pirates would sneak into rail yards at night, loosening bolts on tracks, cutting signal wires, and sometimes placing small explosive devices that would derail supply trains. One successful sabotage operation could delay military shipments for days. Then there was their propaganda war. These teenagers hand-copied anti-Nazi leaflets and newspapers, distributing them in factories, schools and neighborhoods. The content was often brutally honest about Germany's military losses and the reality of concentration camps. Getting caught with one of these leaflets meant immediate arrest and likely execution. What's fascinating is how they protected each other. The Edelweiss pirates developed elaborate codes and secret signals. They knew which adults in their communities could be trusted and which ones might turn them into the Gestapo. Some members carried fake identification papers, while others memorized cover stories to explain their movements around the city. The Nazis, naturally, were furious about these teenage rebels. Heinrich Himmler himself issued orders to crack down on the Edelweiss pirates with extreme prejudice. Special SS units were assigned specifically to hunt them down. The regime was particularly enraged that these were German children, not foreign agents or adult political opponents. The crackdown was swift and brutal. In 1944, 13 members of the Cologne Edelweiss pirates were publicly executed. The youngest was just 16 years old. The Nazis made sure the executions were witnessed by other teenagers as a warning about what happened to those who defied the regime. Many other members were sent to concentration camps or juvenile detention centers that were barely disguised death traps. Some were tortured for information about other resistance cells, others simply disappeared, their families never learning what happened to them. Despite the danger, new members kept joining. Word spread through underground networks about these brave teenagers who refused to accept Nazi rule. Some groups managed to establish contact with Allied forces, providing intelligence about German military movements and industrial targets. The Edelweiss pirates saved lives too. They helped hide forced laborers from Eastern Europe who had escaped from German factories. They provided food and shelter to Jewish families trying to avoid deportation. Some members even helped Allied prisoners of war who had escaped from German camps. After the war ended, you might expect these teenage heroes to be celebrated. Instead, many faced continued persecution from Allied authorities, who viewed any German resistance group with suspicion. Some Edelweiss pirates weren't officially recognized for their bravery until decades later. Their story proves that courage doesn't require adult wisdom or military training. Sometimes it just takes a few teenagers who decide they've seen enough injustice and are willing to do something about it. Speaking of unlikely heroes who documented the war's darkest moments, there was one woman whose camera captured images that would change how the world saw Nazi crimes forever. While other war correspondents stayed safely behind the lines writing about battles, Lee Miller grabbed her camera and walked straight into hell. She didn't just report the war, she documented its darkest corners with a lens that refused to look away. Most people knew her as a glamorous fashion model from the 1920s. Vogue covers, high society parties, the whole 9 yards. But when World War II erupted, Miller traded her silk dresses for combat boots and became something entirely different. A war photographer who would capture images so powerful they'd haunt the world forever. Miller convinced British Vogue to send her to the front lines as their official correspondent. The magazine probably thought they were getting some light feature stories about women's roles in the war effort. Well, they got way more than they bargained for. She landed in Normandy just days after D-Day, when the beaches still reeked of gunpowder and death. While other journalists interviewed generals in comfortable headquarters, Miller waded through mud and debris, photographing the real cost of liberation. Her camera clicked away as medics carried wounded soldiers, as French civilians emerged from bombed-out buildings, as the machinery of war ground forward. But here's where Miller's story gets truly extraordinary. When Allied forces began liberating Nazi concentration camps in 1945, she became the first female photographer to document these horrors. The images she captured at Buchenwald and Dachau showed the world what systematic evil actually looked like. Miller didn't just take pictures from a distance either. She walked through the barracks, past the gas chambers, around the piles of personal belongings stolen from victims. Her photographs revealed skeletal survivors, mass graves, and the industrial machinery of genocide. These weren't abstract concepts anymore, they were real people, real suffering, real evidence. The weird part is how she approached this nightmare with almost clinical determination. While grown men vomited at the sight of the camps, Miller kept working, click after click, roll after roll of film. She knew these images would serve as proof for anyone who might later claim such atrocities never happened. Her most famous photograph shows her taking a bath in Adolf Hitler's personal bathtub in his Munich apartment. The contrast is incredible. Here's this elegant woman relaxing in the dictator's private space while her muddy combat boots sit on his pristine bathroom mat. It's defiance, exhaustion, and dark humor all rolled into one frame. Miller sent these photographs back to London, but many editors thought they were too graphic to publish. The public wasn't ready to see the full truth of what had happened in those camps. Some images didn't appear in print until decades later, when historians finally understood their historical importance. Then there's the personal cost of what she witnessed. Miller came home from the war completely changed. The glamorous model who once posed for surrealist artists now struggled with what we'd recognize today as severe PTSD. She rarely talked about her wartime experiences, even with her own family. For years after the war, Miller's photographs remained buried in archives. People wanted to forget the ugly parts of history and move on with their lives. But those images she captured didn't lose their power just because they were hidden away. They waited, like time bombs of truth, ready to remind future generations about the consequences of unchecked hatred. Her work showed something most war photography missed. Not just the big moments of victory or defeat, but the small human details that made everything real. A child's toy in the rubble, an elderly woman's face as she watched soldiers march past. The exhausted expression of a medic who'd seen too much. Miller proved that being brave doesn't always mean charging into battle with a weapon. Sometimes courage means pointing a camera at things others refuse to see, then making sure the world can't ignore them. Her photographs became weapons against denial, ignorance, and historical amnesia. What makes her story even more remarkable is how she balanced artistic vision with journalistic responsibility. These weren't just documentation shots. They were carefully composed images that communicated the emotional weight of what was happening. Beauty and horror existing in the same frame, forcing viewers to confront uncomfortable truths. The images Miller captured continue influencing how we understand World War II today. Museum exhibits, history textbooks, and documentaries still rely on her photographs to show the reality of Nazi camps. Her camera gave us a window into humanity's darkest chapter. But Miller wasn't the only person using creativity and cunning to fight the Nazi regime. Some resistance fighters discovered that the most effective disguise wasn't military camouflage at all. Sometimes the best way to hide from your enemies was to become completely invisible by blending into plain sight, using nothing more than charm and careful planning. The Germans had a 5 million franc bounty on her head. 5 million. That's roughly $40 million today. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse because she kept slipping through their fingers like smoke. Her real name was Nancy Wake, and she might just be the most dangerous woman you've never heard of properly. Nancy didn't start out planning to become a thorn in Hitler's side. Born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, she was living the high life in Marseille with her wealthy French husband Henri. But here's the thing about Nancy. She had a spine made of steel and zero tolerance for bullies. When she witnessed Nazi brutality firsthand in Vienna during the 1930s, something clicked. She wasn't going to sit this one out. When France fell in 1940, Nancy dove headfirst into resistance work. She started small, helping Allied prisoners of war escape through the Pyrenees to Spain. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. These weren't casual hiking trips. We're talking about treacherous mountain passes, Nazi patrols, and French collaborators who'd sell you out for pocket change. Nancy had this uncanny ability to talk her way out of impossible situations. Once German soldiers stopped her car and found a British airman hiding in the trunk. Nancy calmly explained that he was her lover, and she was smuggling him away from her husband. The soldiers, apparently impressed by her audacity and acting skills, let them go. Can you imagine the nerves that takes? Then there's the time she literally fought her way out of trouble. Nancy wasn't just about clever disguises and fake papers, she could handle herself in a scrap. During one mission, she killed a German sentry with her bare hands to protect her team. No hesitation, no drama, just cold efficiency when lives were on the line. The Gestapo's obsession with catching her became almost comical. They had her photograph plastered everywhere, but Nancy was a master of disguise. She'd change her hair, her clothes, her entire demeanor. One day she'd be a sophisticated Parisian socialite, the next a simple farm girl. The Germans were chasing shadows while she orchestrated escapes right under their noses. Her escape network, known as the Pat O'Leary Line, smuggled over 1,000 Allied servicemen to safety. Think about that number for a second. That's 1,000 families who got their sons, fathers and husbands back instead of death notices. Nancy personally guided many of these men through hostile territory, often walking for days through mountains and forests, but the net was closing. In 1943, the Gestapo arrested her husband Henri while hunting for Nancy. They tortured him for information about his wife's activities. Henri never broke. He died in German custody, without giving up a single detail about Nancy's work. When she learned about his death after the war, it nearly destroyed her. Nancy herself barely escaped France. She fled to Spain, then made her way to Britain, where the Special Operations Executive recruited her immediately. They trained her in everything from explosives to silent killing techniques. Nancy soaked it all up like a sponge. In April 1944, they parachuted her back into France. Her mission: link up with resistance groups in the Auvergne region and prepare for D-Day. This wasn't some behind-the-scenes coordination job. Nancy was expected to lead armed attacks against German positions. She commanded a force of over 7,000 resistance fighters. These weren't professional soldiers, they were farmers, shopkeepers, students. Nancy molded them into an effective fighting force that caused serious headaches for German commanders. Her groups destroyed railways, ambushed convoys, and generally made life miserable for occupying forces. The locals called her Madame André, one of her many code names. She earned their respect the hard way, proving she could outmarch, outfight, and outthink most of the men under her command. Nancy wasn't asking anyone to take risks she wouldn't take herself. During one particularly intense firefight, Nancy's team ran low on ammunition. She volunteered to bicycle through enemy territory, to reach another resistance cell and request supplies. The round trip, over 300 miles through German-controlled countryside. She completed the journey in less than 3 days, bringing back the ammunition that saved her fighters. After D-Day, Nancy's forces went on the offensive. They captured German strongholds, liberated towns, and linked up with advancing Allied armies. By war's end, Nancy had gone from socialite to one of the most effective resistance leaders in occupied Europe. Post-war recognition came slowly for Nancy. She was too busy living life to spend much time talking about her wartime exploits. Australia finally acknowledged her contributions decades later, but Nancy never seemed particularly interested in fame or glory. Speaking of unsung heroes, there's another story that deserves attention, one about an entire family who turned their home into a fortress of hope. Dutch courage isn't just something you find at the bottom of a bottle. Sometimes it shows up in a cramped watchmaker's shop in Haarlem, where an elderly man named Casper ten Boom made a decision that would change everything. The year was 1942, and the Nazis had turned Holland into their personal hunting ground for Jews. Most people kept their heads down and pretended not to see what was happening. But the ten Boom family, they opened their doors wider. Casper ran the shop with his daughters Corey and Betsy. They were devout Christians who believed their faith meant more than Sunday prayers. When desperate Jewish families started knocking on their door in the middle of the night, the ten Booms didn't hesitate. They said yes, then figured out the details later. The problem was obvious. How do you hide people in a house that sits right on a busy street? The answer came from an unlikely source, the local resistance movement. They sent over a man who knew about secret construction. Within days he'd built a hiding space behind Corey's bedroom wall that was barely 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. 7 people could squeeze in there if they had to. They called it the hiding place. Living this double life required incredible planning. The ten Booms had to think about everything: food rationing books, extra blankets, chamber pots, even how to muffle coughs during the day. Their guests, as they called the hidden Jews, had to memorize the layout of the house perfectly. During practice drills, everyone had to disappear into that cramped space within 90 seconds of hearing the buzzer. Then there were the regular visitors who had no idea what was happening upstairs. Customers still came to get their watches repaired. Neighbors dropped by for coffee. The postman made his daily rounds. Each conversation became a careful dance around the truth. But here's what made the ten Booms different from other resistance families. They treated this work like running a business. Corey became the mastermind behind an entire network. She coordinated with other safe houses, arranged for fake identity cards, and even found jobs for Jews who needed to blend in with regular Dutch workers. Her operation saved an estimated 800 lives over 2 years. The scariest moments came during unexpected visits from German soldiers. Picture this: you're upstairs hiding 7 terrified people behind a wall, while downstairs your elderly father is chatting casually with armed Nazis about clock repairs. Casper had this amazing ability to stay completely calm during these encounters. He'd even offer the soldiers tea. The family's Christian faith drove everything they did, but they weren't preachy about it. They simply believed that helping others was what decent people did during terrible times. Betsy would often say that the real tragedy wasn't the risk they were taking, but how few others were willing to take it. Their luck ran out in February 1944. A Dutch informant betrayed them to the Gestapo. When the police arrived for their raid, the current group of hidden Jews managed to get into the secret room just in time. But the Ten Booms themselves weren't so lucky. The entire family was arrested on the spot. What happened next shows just how well their system worked. The Jews hidden behind Corey's bedroom wall stayed there for 3 days while German guards searched the house repeatedly. Local resistance members finally rescued them after the coast was clear. The hiding place had saved their lives one final time. Casper died in prison just 10 days after his arrest. He was 84 years old. Betsy and Corey were sent to the notorious Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. Betsy died there in December 1944, but not before she'd convinced her sister that they needed to forgive their captors. Even in the camp, she insisted that hatred would destroy them faster than any Nazi guard could. Corey survived due to what she later called a clerical error. She was released just days before all women her age were executed. She returned to Holland to discover that their old house had become a symbol of hope for the Dutch resistance. After the war, Corey spent decades traveling the world, telling their story and preaching about forgiveness. She turned their house into a museum where visitors could see the actual hiding place. The narrow space behind the wall still gives people chills today. The Ten Boom family proves that heroes don't always carry weapons or wear uniforms. Sometimes they just carry keys to doors they're willing to open for strangers. Their watchmaker's shop became a place where time stood still for people who desperately needed a safe moment to breathe. But there's another story of collective heroism that's even more remarkable. An entire population that refused to surrender despite facing impossible odds. When you think about World War II heroes, your mind probably jumps to soldiers storming beaches or spies sneaking through enemy lines. But what about an entire population that refused to break under the heaviest bombing campaign per square mile in human history? Malta sat right in the middle of the Mediterranean like a tiny cork in a very important bottle. This small island nation, barely bigger than some American cities, controlled shipping lanes that could make or break the war effort. The Axis powers knew it, the Allies knew it, and the 270,000 people living there, well, they were about to find out just how much their little rock mattered. The Germans and Italians needed Malta gone, not captured. Gone. They launched what would become the most intensive bombing campaign of the entire war. Over 3,000 air raids pounded this island between 1940 and 1942. That's more than 7 bombs per person if you're keeping track. The math gets even crazier when you realize Malta is only 122 square miles. Some parking lots have seen less action, but here's where it gets interesting. The Maltese didn't pack up and leave. They couldn't exactly hop in their cars and drive to safety anyway, being on an island and all. Instead, they dug in. Literally, they carved shelters out of the island's limestone, creating an underground city that could house thousands. Kids went to school in caves. Families ate dinner by candlelight in tunnels. Churches held services in the depths of the earth. The bombing wasn't just annoying background noise either. These weren't warning shots or scattered attacks. German and Italian planes dropped more explosives on Malta than fell on London during the entire Blitz. The harbour, the airfields, the cities. Everything got pounded day after day. Buildings turned to rubble. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Fresh water became more precious than gold. Then there's the siege aspect that made everything worse. Enemy submarines and surface ships surrounded the island, making supply runs nearly impossible. British convoys trying to reach Malta faced brutal attacks. Ships went down loaded with food, medicine and ammunition that never made it to the desperate islanders. By 1942, people were surviving on 1,500 calories per day, if they were lucky. The weird part is how normal life tried to continue. Kids still played games between air raid sirens. Adults went to work rebuilding what got bombed the night before. Shopkeepers opened stores with empty shelves just to maintain some sense of routine. Church bells still rang, though sometimes they were calling people to shelter instead of prayer. Malta's defenders weren't just sitting around waiting for rescue either. The island's handful of fighter planes, nicknamed Faith, Hope and Charity by locals, took on massive enemy formations. These 3 planes, and the pilots crazy enough to fly them, shot down dozens of Axis aircraft before being shot down themselves. New planes arrived whenever a convoy got through, but they rarely lasted long. The spring of 1942 brought the worst of it. Food rations dropped so low that people were eating carob pods and grass soup. The last Spitfire fighter was destroyed. German bombers could attack almost on purpose. Victory seemed impossible, yet nobody talked about surrender. Maybe they were too stubborn. Maybe they understood what giving up would mean for the entire Mediterranean theatre. British leaders watched this unfold with growing amazement. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had seen plenty of courage during the war, but Malta was different. This wasn't soldiers following orders or spies completing missions. This was an entire civilian population choosing to endure hell rather than give up their strategic piece of rock. The turning point came when a few crucial supply convoys finally broke through the siege. Operation Pedestal in August 1942 delivered just enough fuel, food and ammunition to keep the island fighting. The tanker Ohio limped into harbor with her back broken, but her cargo intact. Maltese civilians cheered from the harbor walls, knowing they'd live to fight another day. By late 1942, the tide was turning. More supplies got through, more fighter planes arrived. The bombing raids grew less frequent as German attention shifted to other theaters. Malta had survived its trial by fire and remained in Allied hands. King George VI made an unprecedented decision in April 1942. He awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian honor for gallantry, to the entire island of Malta. Not to individuals, but to everyone. The citation read simply, "To honor her brave people." It was the first and only time an entire population received such recognition. Malta's survival changed the war in ways that rippled far beyond those limestone cliffs. But their story represents something bigger than strategy and supply lines. Something about ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage when everything seemed lost. And speaking of choosing courage when the odds looked impossible, there were millions of other forgotten heroes whose names we'll never know. The stories you've heard represent just a tiny fraction of the millions who stood up during humanity's darkest hour. For every hero whose name we know, thousands more remain anonymous. Their courage wasn't captured in photographs or documented in official reports. No medals hang on their walls, but their actions changed everything. Think about it this way. We've explored 30 extraordinary individuals and groups. Each one faced impossible odds. Each one could have chosen safety over sacrifice, yet they didn't. Now multiply that courage by millions. That's the real scope of human bravery during World War II. The math is staggering. Historians estimate that over 500,000 people actively participated in resistance movements across occupied Europe alone. Add the countless civilians who provided safe houses, shared food with strangers, or simply refused to turn in their neighbors. We're talking about an underground army of ordinary people who became extraordinary when it mattered most. But here's what makes their stories even more remarkable. Most of these heroes never expected recognition. Eileen Neon worked as a cleaning lady for decades after the war, never mentioning her espionage work. We're told Pilecki's family didn't learn the full extent of his Auschwitz mission until years after his execution. The Night Witches returned to normal jobs as teachers, engineers and mothers. They saved the world, then went back to living in it. Many carried their secrets to the grave. Imagine sitting next to someone on a bus, not knowing they once sabotaged Nazi supply lines. Your elderly neighbor might have smuggled Jewish children to safety. That quiet librarian could have been a code breaker who shortened the war by months. The barber down the street perhaps fought off an entire enemy battalion single-handedly. Then there are the stories we'll never hear. Children who carried messages and died before they could grow up to tell their tales. Resistance fighters executed in anonymous fields. Families who hid refugees and were discovered, leaving no survivors to share what happened. Their sacrifice was complete and silent. The weight of remembering falls on us. Not just the famous names or the medal recipients, but the forgotten millions who chose courage over comfort. They remind us that heroism isn't reserved for special people. It's available to anyone willing to pay the price. What's fascinating is how these ordinary heroes found each other. Networks formed organically. A baker who provided food to hidden families would connect with a train conductor who helped people escape. A secretary with access to German documents would find a radio operator to transmit the intelligence. Courage attracted courage, creating webs of resistance that the Nazis never fully understood or destroyed. Some of the most powerful stories involve split-second decisions that changed everything. A farmer who chose to lie when soldiers asked about strangers. A nurse who decided to treat enemy wounded as human beings. A child who kept quiet when questioned about unusual activity in the neighborhood. These moments of choice rippled outward, affecting thousands of lives. The diversity of their backgrounds proves that heroism has no prerequisites. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, young and old, religious and secular, they came from every possible background. Geography didn't matter either. Heroes emerged in frozen Russian forests, scorching African deserts, tropical Pacific islands, and bombed-out European cities. Many faced impossible moral choices. Should you save your own family or help strangers? Do you risk your entire resistance cell to save one captured member? How do you choose between competing goods when any decision might lead to death? These heroes navigated ethical mazes that would challenge the greatest philosophers, making life and death choices with incomplete information and no time for deliberation. Their legacy extends far beyond the war itself. The moral courage they displayed influenced civil rights movements, shaped international law, and inspired generations of activists. When people stand up to oppression today, they're walking paths first carved by these World War II heroes. What strikes you most about these stories? Maybe it's the sheer audacity of a teenager deciding to fight the most powerful military machine in history. Perhaps it's the quiet determination of people who kept going despite losing everything. Could be the way they found hope in hopeless situations. Their message echoes across decades. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept the unacceptable. Evil only wins when good people choose safety over action. These forgotten heroes proved that individuals matter, that single acts of courage can cascade into movements that change the world. We owe them more than memory. We owe them the commitment to recognize similar moments in our own time. Because somewhere right now the next generation of ordinary heroes is being tested. Will they have the same courage their predecessors showed when everything was on the line? But there's something else these heroes share, something that might surprise you about what really drove their incredible courage.